on cspan.org. C-SPAN is live at the National Governors Association Winter Meeting, which is being held in Washington, D.C.
To my colleagues and our visitors who are joining us today, it's certainly an honor to serve as chair of the National Governors Association. We're going to have some new faces in the room over these next couple days. I recognize many of them are still coming in from breakfast. Many of the 22 new governors who took office this year will be in attendance throughout the weekend. It's one of the largest classes of new governors ever before. And I have no doubt that they will bring that same spirit of bipartisanship and camaraderie, and a willingness to engage in thoughtful discussion, even if we don't necessarily agree on every issue, with their fellow governors from across the country. Governor Hogan, as vice chair, and I have become strong partners in working with governors all across the nation to tackle some of the most pressing issues facing our states. And one of the issues that we know that almost every governor faces is how we're playing a constructive role in ensuring that every American has a good job that they can be proud of. We're in the midst of profound economic and social transformations, certainly characterized by technological disruption, global forces, a changing workforce, and decades of middle-class stagnation. I often say I had regular access to the governor's house as a kid, but it's because I delivered newspapers to it. It's raised in a single-parent household, paycheck to paycheck. Went from doing that to now raising our 3 kids in the governor's residence. So I've only made it 4 blocks in life. But if I think about when I was a kid growing up, 90% of 30-year-olds were doing better than their parents were at age 30. Today, only half of 30-year-olds are doing better than their parents. 44% of Americans, if they had an emergency that they needed $400, they wouldn't necessarily have that opportunity to even have that $400. From 1935 to 1960, the standard of living doubled. From 1960 to 1985, the standard of living doubled again. And since then, it's laid flat. We can despair, or ultimately we can look forward. And I'm optimistic. We're about halfway through my chair's initiative, Good Jobs for All Americans. We've been holding a series of regional workshops, heard from dozens of policy leaders that have come from over half of the states across the country. We've heard time and time again that we can shape technological and economic transformation rather than having it shape us. By actively working with businesses, educators, workers, and others, we can ensure that the future of work is even brighter than the present of work. And by rethinking education and workforce training, by reimagining what the social contract in 2019 requires between the public sector and the private sector, we can create opportunity where seemingly no opportunity exists. If I've learned anything through this initiative, it's that there's a greater need for leadership from the governors than ever before. Americans know that these changes are already at our doorstep. When surveyed, 72% of working adults will tell you that they feel the need to get more education and training. Yet here in the U.S., we invest less in education for adults than nearly any other advanced economy. We've heard loud and clear that we need to equip today's workers with new skills. We've identified the need for a lifelong system of learning in our country that meets people where they are and gives them the education and new skills that they need. Nonetheless, we spend about $122 billion a year at the federal level when it comes to investments in higher education, and only $9.5 billion a year when it comes to workforce training. We've identified the pressing need for employers to hire workers based on skills and competencies, not just degrees. And we've identified the need for those employers to be investing in their employees over the long term. And we've heard that how many employers are struggling with these same issues and how we can challenge them to do more. A recent study by the World Economic Forum estimates that as many as 1.4 million workers may be displaced by technology in the next decade. and that the cost of retraining those workers for new jobs could be as much as $34 billion. The cost of not retraining them, however, it's incalculably higher, both in social and in economic terms. The private sector must do more to provide good jobs and pathways for workers, but they certainly can't do it alone. As governors, we're well positioned to bring together employers, educators, and workers to build a new infrastructure for the jobs of the future. And we have to figure out a way to ensure that businesses are as incentivized to invest in their workers as they are into equipment. Finally, we've heard how rural communities are working to redefine and reimagine themselves, and how state policies can support a stronger rural ecosystem that empowers local entrepreneurs and civic leaders. Between 2005 and 2015, there were 150,000 new businesses started and created in the United States. 2/3 of our counties, though, in the nation actually lost businesses during that time. Only 1/3 gained both the 150 and all the losses. We know that we have to do much more in bridging that urban-rural divide, because if part of America is falling behind, all of America is falling behind. We've learned a lot through this initiative, but we still have a long way to go. I remain confident that we have the tools we need to expand upward mobility, safeguard economic opportunity for current and future workers. Certainly look forward to working with all of the governors in the coming months and all of you. We put together a short video with highlights from the current effort and workshops to date.
The pay makes a good job. Of course, salary, work environment, all the conditions, benefits, of course.
A good job would be something that you can express yourself unabashedly and get rewarded from it, not only fiscally, but emotionally as well.
I guess a good job is just something where you're feeling fulfilled, and I mean, if you can make some good money with it and support your family, that's a great thing too. But I think that it's more important to be happy where you're spending 40 or 50 hours a week than making, $200,000 a year.
I want a job that really gives to the community more than it gives to anything else. It's maybe I would be an environmental worker or veterinarian, something that actually gives instead of you just taking.
Governors are uniquely positioned to really bring together the different facets of our overall workforce system, from private employers to our educational system to state government to higher ed. We're not getting enough skills to individuals, even for today's workforce. Re-engaging workers and saying, do we need to upskill or change the skills that you have? Or how do we better apply the skills that you already have and make sure that those are recognized? And we need to focus on that urban-rural disconnect at times and make sure that our rural areas have the economic opportunities and job-creating opportunities. Because if we leave one part of the country behind, the whole country goes down a little bit in that respect.
We believe that the fundamental promise in America, the covenant that we have with one another, is fundamentally broken right now. The promise that if you work hard and you set high goals, that you can provide for yourself and for your family and for your community.
We have dedicated resources to really going out, engaging those employers to say, how can we help you connect with education that's in your local area?
And I tell people all the time, particularly when I talk to younger people, that when I was their age, there are certain technologies and devices that are available now were not imagined. And so it's making sure that they understand that they're preparing for a future that they cannot really imagine.
And the end game of this process, the Good Jobs for All Americans initiative, is really to be able to give to all of our governors more or less a toolkit. Here are some of the best practices. One of the best things that governors can do is take from the best practices from other states. We learn from these laboratories of democracy the best way to bring things forward.
So we've assembled a great panel today to kick off and talk about many of the facets of creating good jobs for all Americans. Secretary Penny Pritzker is an entrepreneur, a civic leader, philanthropist with a wide array of public and private experiences, including Secretary of Commerce, where she led the first ever skilled workforce initiative at the department. She was co-chair of the Council on Foreign Relations Independent Task Force, which recently issued their report. It's called The Work Ahead: Machine Skills and U.S. Leadership in the 21st Century. We're so pleased you could join us today, Secretary.
Thank you, Governor.
Now, Richard Haass, right next, certainly needs no introduction, but for anybody who hasn't had a chance to work with him, he's an American diplomat, an academic, has been president of the Council on Foreign Relations since 2003, served as Director of Policy Planning for the U.S. Department of State, been a close advisor to former Secretary of State Colin Powell, has a long history of service to our nation's diplomatic corps. And for the last 4 years, Deborah and James Fallows have been traveling through rural America reporting on innovation of all kinds. Their national best-selling book on the project, Our Town's 100,000-Mile Journey into the Heart of America, was published in May. James is a longtime correspondent for The Atlantic magazine, written 12 books, won a National Book Award, worked for 2 years in the White House as President Jimmy Carter's chief speechwriter and as founding chairman of New America. Deborah is a writer and a linguist. She's written extensively on language, education, families and work, China, and travel for The Atlantic, National Geographic, Slate, the New York Times, and Washington Monthly. James, Deborah, Richard, and Secretary, thank you so much for joining us. Please give them a round of applause. Secretary Pritzker, I'll open it up with you. As the co-chair of the Council of Foreign Relations Task Force, and this is something that, when I read, I knew that we had to have you speaking to our overall crew. I know that you and your team came up with a series of recommendations along the way of how we can better link workforce and education. Could you give us a sense of that?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having us here today. You know, Governor, I think the fact that you've made good jobs for all Americans a centerpiece of what you're doing at the NGA is really terrific. Because we all know that the people in our communities are being affected by these seismic forces of innovation, automation, artificial intelligence, and globalization, and that also that the nature of work is changing. What the report is, and there's a slide deck that we've put together for you, governors, is really a menu of opportunities for you to consider policies to implement in your states. Because you as governors sit at the fulcrum point of being able to actually change the opportunity set for the people in your states. And let me just give you a couple of examples of some of the recommendations. First is to begin with a review in your state, which you've done, Governor, in Montana, of, you know, what are the skills gaps that exist? What's the difference between what your business community needs and what is your community colleges, your universities, your high schools offering in terms of training? And that gap analysis is really critical to beginning to set out what's the work plan to address the challenge. And there's companies, both in the book and in the handout that we've given you, we've listed, here's who you can go to who will help you do that assessment, whether it's LinkedIn or Burning Glass or EMSI, they'll help your states do this assessment. And they'll give you the data, because you have to start with the best possible data about what are your jobs needs and also what are your community colleges and other training organizations offering. I think second is really recognizing that the community colleges are your leverage point. These institutions are so vital to so many in our communities, particularly those who are at the lower end of the economic spectrum, as well as those who are mid-career and need retraining. And there are organizations that can help you align, what's going on in your community colleges with what's happening, what your businesses need. Again, you as governors are the people who can bring together your educational institutions, your businesses, your NGOs that provide mentorship to address these issues. So there's organizations like Pathways to Prosperity, which I think is out here. They've got a kiosk here, or Skillful, that are working with different governors to make sure that your credentialing system is something that's both relevant but also is stackable and valuable to the worker. And then and I'll put in a shameless plug for Select USA here, which is an organization that I helped found when I was Secretary of Commerce. You want to go out and leverage your workforce investment to bring in new employers. Every governor is a salesperson out selling your state, right? And what Select USA is helping with foreign direct investment. But you've got to go out and say, here, I've got this workforce investment. I have the supply chain that can help support you as a company in your endeavors. And I would suggest one thing is, and our report does, you want a point person in your organization as governor that can quarterback in your administration on workforce and on education and on economic development, because bringing all those disparate parts of your government together to work and be aligned and coordinating the interagency is really tough. Finally, I would just say that our report throws out some really interesting ideas that are being tried by different states. And as I said, the report's really a menu of options, but for example, lifelong learning accounts. Washington State has a pilot going on where they're experimenting with tax advantage accounts where both an employee and employer can set aside money for training. Or Connecticut, Georgia, Virginia, Rhode Island, Kentucky, Mississippi all have a program where they're basically providing worker training tax credits. That's another option available to you. And finally, there's the question of, would you maybe have state-run automatic and individual retirement accounts? Because one of the problems is people are not getting benefits from their some of their jobs, particularly in the gig economy. Anyway, the point of the report, and that's a really fast summary, is there's lots of options, and it's very much targeted to you as governors. And it's something that is meant to be a useful tool for you and your staffs. Obviously, you'll learn from each other. And finally, we put our contact information at the back of it so that the resources that the Council on Foreign Relations made available to develop this menu can be made available to you or your staff or whoever would like to learn more.
And there are so many things in that report that's kind of transformational in the way that we all need to begin to think. Like, I started a future-ready workforce for Montana, just dealing with a cabinet. I mean, a sub-cabinet, and bringing in education and bringing everybody to take a peek at where that can go. And other things like that we need to be doing.
Exactly.
You are not always the most optimistic human being, it seems, Richard, but with regard to the ongoing debate about automation, you do provide, on the one hand, what I'd say is an optimistic view that we're unlikely to face mass unemployment, but you also give us the warning that while technologies can increase the productivity and our quality of life, they only lift all boats if the gains are equally distributed. So how do we make sure that in a changing world that millions of Americans aren't left behind by these changes?
Well, it's the right question, it's the right issue, and you're all to be commended for focusing on it. It's the reason that we had this task force, which Secretary Pritzker co-chaired. The stakes here are enormous. We're already seeing signs in the United States, and look at Western Europe, of large amounts of populism. You ain't seen nothing yet. The amount of jobs that will be destroyed by the new technologies will be great. And while the new technologies will create a lot of jobs at the same time, the mismatch between the skill levels the jobs require and the skill levels our existing workforce has. That mismatch is large. And unless we close that gap, we are going to have, I think, massive social problems, and we are not going to even have anything like the bandwidth we need to deal with the foreign policy issues that I believe we need to deal with. What I think is going to make this really hard is it's only going to hit us gradually. The more I look at public policy, the most difficult group of policies to deal with are what I would call slow motion crises, because they happen gradually. And until they really hit, it's very hard to galvanize the sense of urgency you need, the resource allocation you need. But by the time they hit, it's too late. Most of the good options have gone, and that'll be true with climate. It'll be true with this. It'll be true with dealing with debt, you name it. So I think the fact that you're addressing it now is exactly right. But I think you also have to make the case for it, because it's not necessarily obvious to everybody in the society. But by the time it's obvious, again, it's too late. I would just say most of the work, and Penny Pritzker laid it out, is going to have to be in 3 areas. One is education. We can talk about that more. But a real menu of education, and it's probably, I still think the most basic, besides all the life learning approaches and flexibility, will be foundational. It's really glib to say someone's 48 years old, he or she is just out of a job because the job disappeared, we're just going to re-educate and retrain them. Unless they've got a strong educational foundation, that is not going to be easy. So looking at what we do in K through 12 and the rest, I still think is essential. Secondly, one thing you can do uniquely as governors is to make it easier to move from state to state and do the same thing without having to get re-credentialed. You have control over that. It is absurd that people in the business of hairdressing and the rest can't simply take their talents and do it in all 50 states. Obviously, other fields like teaching a little bit more, its own politics, but that is something that is in the power of this group to resolve. That's not a Washington issue, that's an NGA issue. I would make that a priority, because you could do that with and essentially for one another and for yourselves. And lastly, and this gets at and I heard the phrase already, the laboratories of democracy theme. In terms of portability of benefits, safety nets, increasingly we are going to have to separate so much of our safety nets from quasi-permanent full-time jobs. We're going to have to assume that we have a society where people have 10 to 20 jobs in the course of their career. Some of these are going to be full-time, some of these are going to be part-time. And we need to create a society that allows people to have that degree of mobility. And again, the innovation is going to happen, I think, at the state and city level much more than it's going to happen at the Washington level.
Thanks, Richard. And I mean, a lot there. I mean, interesting even on one point. I think in 1950, 5% of jobs needed a state license. Today, it's 29%, and it's often state by state through our licensing boards, for sure. Deborah and James, you traveled all across America. You didn't spend enough time in Montana.
Not yet.
Come back on that. But you were collecting stories for the book. And the book, as I said, it's Our Town. It's a 100,000-mile journey into the heart of America. But in that, you highlight innovation as the hallmark of many of the communities that you saw. What were some of the most startling or intriguing stories of innovation that you saw while on the ground?
I'll give one or two, and then Deb will have another two. First, I'll say it's such an honor to be here with the NGA, because the main theme of our reports in this book is that mayors and governors are the people who are getting things done in the country now. So we're really glad to have this chance to talk with you. Our main focus, in addition to the workforce issues that you've just heard about, which we agree on, has been on communities, the way that smaller communities are able to revive their economies, attract people back there, revive businesses that might have been overtaken by technology. And there were three themes we saw there. I'll mention briefly, then one or two examples. One is to remember how acutely place-conscious Americans still are. People who are from West Virginia will always be from West Virginia in their minds. People from the South are from the South. People from Montana are from Montana. And there's a tremendous reservoir of a mental hold on people who might have grown up in some place, moved away from a small town in South Dakota, worked in Chicago or San Francisco, but have in mind the idea of going back there sometime, some connection there. That is stronger than you would think. A second thing we found in communities that were able to get economic prospects is a very acute awareness of their own particular local strengths and weaknesses. That places in the agricultural regions knew that some kind of farm technology was their chance. Places in scenic regions knew that tourism was a better opportunity. So knowing clearly the strengths and weaknesses of each community by community setting was important. The other was these communities seemed to take a long incremental view. They weren't going to solve their problems in 6 months or in 1 year, but they had 5 or 10 year plans, and if they could measure some progress along the way, then they could do something. Just to give you 2 or 3 examples of the kinds of places we're talking about, and then Deb will describe one a little more. Eastport, Maine is a place right on the Bay of Fundy that has lost its sardine canning business, but they've been extremely innovative at having new port business and having renewable energy from the Bay of Fundy. Spearville, Kansas, they've augmented their traditional wheat growing business with wind turbines, which are now providing all kinds of revenue to the town. Many parts of West Virginia, which have all the problems we're familiar with, recognize they have scenic assets, which are among the rare ones in the country. And if Vermont and Montana and Colorado and Wyoming can make themselves resort destinations, West Virginia thinks it can too. Fresno, California, in the agricultural region, not a small area, but sort of a traditionally hard-pressed one, is becoming a center of advanced agricultural technology. Duluth, Minnesota, which had a long rise and then decline, is now a manufacturing and tourist destination too. Across the country, we saw these examples of cities, regions, and working with our governors to say, we can figure out an innovative approach for our community. We can match the talent we have here to opportunities we can create, and we can have a growing area. And our book, its main point is to have examples from much of the country, not yet Montana, will be there in the next leg. But Deb will give you one more illustration.
I'd like to talk about a town where we spend a lot of time. It's called Ajo in Arizona, in southwest Arizona. It's a very tiny town, only 3,000 people, and it's extremely remote. It's 40 miles from the next town, which is Gila Bend, 80 miles from the nearest hospital, 120 miles from a rental car agency in Phoenix. Ajo was a thriving community through much of the 20th century because of its copper mine, the biggest copper mine that led this as deep as this Empire State Building is tall. The mine failed in about 1985, and then the town started going downhill until about a dozen years later, a group of citizens got together and said, we need to save this town. And they came from the 3 main ethnic groups that had supported the mining town through its entire existence: the Tohono O'odham tribe from the native reservation, the Mexicans from just across the border who lived in Ajo the whole time, and the Anglos. And they decided on a dramatic 3-part turnaround for this town. It was based on a man-made asset that they had, which was the old Company Town School, which they turned around the idea was to turn around it into a conference center and make it a permanent revenue stream. They trained the unemployed in Ajo of all ages with apprenticeships to do the kinds of jobs it took to make that: plumbing, electricians, carpentry, painters, all skilled jobs that led to certification in those jobs. And once the conference center was built, they knew that they could continue to have jobs in that town in restoring the housing stock and maintaining the public buildings in that town. There were 2 other additional efforts. One was in agriculture and food. It is a rough place to grow food. It's the middle of the Sonoran Desert. It's hot, it's cold, it has no rainfall, and the clay soil is not conducive to good crop growing. On the other hand, the Tohono O'odham tribe had been living there for centuries and centuries and knew how to grow crops there. So they helped the other people in the town figure out what kind of agriculture would work, and they spread this effort throughout the town. The school has gardens, the clinic has gardens, all the homes have gardens, a restaurant have gardens, and they turned that into a big piece of the tourist industry, where people would come by and go to the restaurants and have this other kind of food. The third thing that they did was lean towards something that the town had always developed, which is being an artistic community. Everyone loves the light in Ajo, and everyone is an artist of some sort. So at the conference center, they provided subsidized housing for artists to kind of instigate and instill this sense of how important the arts could be in a community. And the people in the town were artists of their own nature, and they made the town beautiful as another draw for not only tourists to be there, but as a better place for themselves to be there. Those three things worked to turn this town around. And the last time we were there, they were having conferences in the conference center and weddings in the conference center. Part of the secret, if there's a secret sauce in this, is that at the very beginning, they knew how to work the system of finding grants at all levels, from the states and from the national government, to jumpstart this effort and really get it all going.
Deborah, one of the things you mentioned about AHO when they were coming together was apprenticeships and work-based learning. And there's over 1,000 different apprenticeable fields. We started 21 of them in healthcare alone just in the last few years. But also one thing that we had in Montana is we have 85 microbreweries. We have microbreweries in a town of 400, but we couldn't find enough brewers, so we started an apprenticeship in microbrewing. Now, one of your conclusions in your book is you've got a microbrewery in town, you have vitality. Now, why? What made you think that, or is it just that you like good beer?
So, well, at the end of the book, we have 10.5 signs of civic success. The 10 of them are worthy points. The 1/2 is having a microbrewery. And so the reason it's there, partly we love beer, partly it's a proxy for having a certain kind of entrepreneurial class, a certain kind of customer class. It's ways to develop downtowns. You can get like the arts movement. Also, I worked, as the governor mentioned long ago, for President Carter as a speechwriter in the White House. One of his great and underappreciated achievements was deregulating home brewing. Jimmy Carter is the father of the craft brew revolution in the United States.
And is that where Billy Beer came from? Secretary Pritzker, every governor ultimately does want to make sure that we're providing sort of the good opportunities and good job opportunities for the residents of our states. And we know that an educated and skilled workforce is a critical factor then in attracting and creating those good jobs. A lot of new and exciting initiatives, certainly linking workforce needs and education, taking place across the country. What's the economic payoff for states that do this well, and what really should be the public role, and what's the role of businesses?
Well, there's a big economic payoff, I think, and I think this question of what is the public role, what is the private role, is really important. And I would, if there's just one concept, I would say you come away with partnership. What Jim and Deborah pointed out in their stories is that each state, and in fact, regions of states, are different. I mean, if you look at downstate Illinois versus Chicago, there's a lot of difference there. We're both a big city, have a big city, and we have very rural areas in our state. And so the question is, how do you bring businesses together with government leadership to address what's needed in one part of your state may be different than what's needed in a different part of your state. And I think that's extremely important. That's why I think it's really important to have this assessment of where is the authentic right to win for each part of your state. And that requires your business leadership, your private sector, your NGOs, your universities, your community colleges coming together. And I'll say it again, you as governors are the unique capability of convening those groups and sitting and saying, where do we have an authentic right to win? Whether it's brewing or it's artificial intelligence or it's something in between, it's agriculture. And then really, how do you begin to get the resources from those various categories of business, of educational institutions, training, research, government, all working together to say we're going to have initiative to make that cluster or that sector of our economy really hum. And a significant part of that is making sure you've got a workforce that is being trained for that opportunity. You know, in Chicago, we're working on an initiative called P33. We're really trying to figure out how do we, become a tier 1 tech city in Chicago. We have enormous assets, but they're not working together. And part of the challenge is how do you bring all these assets from national labs, universities. We train more number 2 trainer of technology students in the country come out of the Chicago area, and half of them are leaving to go to the coast. What do we do to bring, we have accelerators, we have incubators, we have all these assets. They're not working in conjunction with each other right now. So that's a challenge that we're very focused on. That's the kind of initiative that a governor could be leading. Private sector happens to be leading this effort, and the government is supporting it, but it's going to require both the private sector and public sector. That's just an example.
Well, thank you. Richard, in this country, often we see education as sort of a one and done, which really isn't working that well for many people, especially for mid-career workers. But lifelong learning is at times a hard sell. Lots of people didn't like school that much, and they're happy to be done with it. Or mid-career workers, I mean, getting additional education can be complicated. How can we both sell Americans on the idea that given that pace of technological change and the impact on their jobs and careers, they need to continue learning and relearning, and what should governors be doing to encourage this?
It's a great question. 2 things let me suggest. One is, do not underestimate the power of your voice on this issue. This is not obvious. Most of us in our brain have this image of education is something that you front load in your life. You do it until you're 16, 18, 22, what have you. And then you live off that. The image I like to use is we have the tank of gas mentality to education. We fill her up, and then we drive down the highway of life for the next 50 years. The problem is there is 0 chance, not 1% chance, 0 chance that that initial tank of gas will see us through the next 50 years. I don't care what your field is. Technology is changing too fast, the economy is, and even if you stay in the same field as a doctor, already every doctor has to constantly improve or make himself or herself aware of changes. So part of it is to simply make the case, what I would call topping it off. We've all got to top off our intellectual tank. I would ask that you consider making this one of your regular themes when you talk to the people in your state, to have them reimagine education. And then the other half of it, the second point, is to make it less difficult for them to do that. And Penny mentioned some of those things before. Why don't we have things like individual education accounts that are tax advantaged, that allow us at the age of 45 or 55 or whenever to maybe go get that extra course online at the community college, or take 6 months or a year. We've got to take a step backward. Got to support my family while I do it, but then I can take a step forward. Well, why can't businesses, which get all sorts of tax credits for buying and incorporating new technology, why is investment in people any less significant than investment in a new machine? Why don't we think about how we expand R&D taxes, tax advantages, credits, for the people who work for us? And then lastly, I think you as governors can have model programs to people who work for you. You can not just talk the talk, you can walk the walk. The people who work in state government, there could be training and learning opportunities that are mid-career. One of the things I liked about AT&T that they introduced is a year before a job would disappear, they would go to the work and say, because of technology or what have you, we know that your job will not exist in a year. You've been a really good worker. You're 48 years old. You've got years you've got to keep working. Let's work together on figuring out what kind of education and training you can need, so when this job fades out, we can fade in another job, and that you're ready for it and all that. And I think that ought to be increasingly the mentality.
Thanks, Richard. Deborah and James, you point to community colleges as really providing opportunity and a large role in connecting people who have lost economic opportunities with new ones. In what ways could we better support community colleges? What should governors be doing to kind of light a fire under our educational institutions?
So Deb and I really have the passion of converts on this issue. We've spent a lot of time living outside the U.S. We lived in China for many years, in Japan, Southeast Asia, and from there you think naturally that the great research universities are the key to American strength, and of course they are. But traveling the last 4 or 5 years, we really think that community colleges are the institution of this moment because they have the power to connect the opportunities that do exist, as you know, in all your states in skilled technical fields with people who need those opportunities. Essentially, the next generation of people whose parents worked in factories and the factories aren't there anymore, to be prepared for the new jobs that do exist in the health field and advanced manufacturing and all the other things you know on a state-by-state basis. So we really feel as if this is a theme we've tried to push, and it's important for you all too. One point I'll make before Deb giving you a specific illustration is the way we're impressed. There is a web of education. A theme from everybody here has been the connectedness of things. So we've seen revolutions in K-12 training around the country of having these very advanced career technical programs. We've seen in South Carolina, we've seen them in California, we've seen them in Georgia, and we write about those in our book. Then the community colleges themselves. I see Governor Brown here from Oregon, where Central Oregon, of course, not having a four-year university until recently. The community college there has been just indispensable. Then working with research universities, and we've seen new kinds of partnerships and companies as well. So I think that our theme has been that the community colleges are, if you had to give your next 5 educational speeches, I would suggest 4 of them being about community colleges, and the other one, the 5th, being about the connectedness of the whole web.
So here's an example of what Jim was talking about from Northeast Mississippi. There's an area called the Golden Triangle, which is Columbus, Starkville, and West Point in Mississippi. What failed there was the Sara Lee factory closed down, the blue jeans factory, the toilet seat manufacturer, and the headstone factory. There was nothing left. But the people in that area had vision, and they had land. And they went for the big plan, which was to attract, ultimately, $6 billion in new heavy industry. One of the keys to getting the industry to come to that area was the promise of a trained and trainable workforce. So they partnered with East Mississippi Community College and gave the new students, who were people who had lost their jobs or younger people who were looking for jobs, training in specifically to go into the new drone factory, the new helicopter factory, the new truck engine factory, the high-tech steelworks, and Yokohama Tire. In that community college, they specifically geared toward training those students on the equipment and the machine tools that would be necessary to run those high-tech factories. Which they did, and they even installed kind of mini shop floors of the factories in that community college. Not everybody was going to end up with a job in those factories, but everybody who went through those programs was going to end up with those high-tech skills that would be transferable to other jobs in other places.
I'll soon open it up for questions from the governors, but before I do, for any or all of you, really, what's at stake here in how we address education and workforce training, and what happens if we don't get it right?
Well, I think the first thing is our prosperity, and the second, which is evidenced by the fact the Council on Foreign Relations, really underwrote this task force on, a skilled workforce, is ultimately our national security. Because if we don't have economic prosperity, if we have potentially political chaos, as Richard was talking about, we can't, and our competitiveness, our global competitiveness is really at stake. And frankly, competitiveness is something that has to get broken down from the national level to be more locally considered. And it evolves around, again, the specialties in your states, the specialties in your cities and rural areas, the capabilities, and why do take foreign countries? Why do those companies come here to the United States? They're looking and saying, well, I want to be closer to the customer. I want to serve that customer. But if we're not training our people, they're not going to bring their factories here, nor are we going to survive as a country, as a leading country in the world.
If we don't get this right, we are going to suffer an epidemic of chronic unemployment and prolonged unemployment. And the costs of that will be immense. It's the benefits that have to go to the people who are unemployed. It's the forfeited productivity and income taxes that people who are not working, we lose in that way. There'll be a direct link to the opioid crisis that we have. So there's a resource issue. There's, I worry about the social divisiveness, because then it will trigger all sorts of debates about things. You get into this question of what the floor then needs to be for our society, and I think that will be divisive. I also think that it will soak, as I mentioned before, it'll take up a lot of bandwidth. I think in a funny sort of way, we will end up being much more isolationist if we don't get this right, because we're not going to have the resources we need to have a large role in the world, and we're not going to have the political focus we need. There will be a sense of we don't have the luxury of focusing on the rest of the world. We've got to focus here at home and taking care of our own. The problem with that is that what happens in the rest of the world will dramatically affect the fate of the American people, but we won't be able to see that through. And then lastly, it's not just, as Penny said, it's a competitiveness issue, but one of the most powerful parts of American foreign policy is the example we set. We want to be a place, the economy, the society, our political system, that others actually want to emulate. We want to see democracies and markets grow around the world. If we don't get it right here, if we can't be an example, why do we think we're going to be able to preach to others that they should adopt those policies? It will fall on deaf ears. One of the reasons, to be blunt, you said I'm a pessimist. Well, I'll just be a realist here. The fact that China's influence around the world is rising in many cases is because ours is falling. It's not that the Chinese have figured it out. I would actually make the prediction they've not figured it out, and they are going to suffer all sorts of, or experience all sorts of political, economic, demographic, environmental challenges, you name it. They have baked a lot into their cake that is going to be very difficult for them to swallow. But people are looking at what's going on here, particularly at the federal level, and they do not see something that's working, which again, I think, pushes things back on you all, that this becomes the level of American governance that people increasingly want to emulate. And in many ways, you become part then of the foreign policy conversation in ways in how others see the United States. And again, I don't think, at the end of the day, the reason we did this study, foreign policy is too important to be left to the diplomats. And I once wrote a book called Foreign Policy Begins at Home. It doesn't end at home. It's not an argument for isolationism, but it begins at home. This is the base of all else. This is the base of resources. It's the example we set. It's the degree of social cohesion. And this is right now probably the biggest single threat to all of that. Because again, if we institutionalize prolonged unemployment in our country, I worry about what would be the repercussions of that.
Deb and James, what's at stake?
I will have our combined brief voice, unless you want to add to this too. So, which is, I think there's an interesting historical analogy here. Eventually, societies do adjust to any technological change. 200 years ago, almost all Americans were farmers. Only about 1% are now. We adjusted to that. But there are easier and harder ways to make the adjustment. The 1930s were a bad adjustment. The 1970s, 80s, there were lots of hardship. But the GI Bill period was a time that showed you could make an easier and more productive adjustment. So using the GI Bill period of saying we can help people make these technological transitions in a way that is better for families, better for communities, better for the nation, that's a goal we can set.
And can I add one
Please,
more point?
absolutely.
Yes. One more tiny log on the fire is training the teachers to teach all of these high-tech skills. We learned this in San Bernardino, California, that has a multi-track high-skills education high school. And they said to me that one of their most important issues right now is to find the teachers or to train up the teachers so that they are skilled not only in being good teachers, but in the specifics that they are teaching these kids.
Yeah, good point. Thank you. Questions from any governors? Please, Governor.
I am not a state I am a territory, but all of the things that you said, I really agree and very much apply to our island. I just wanted to hear, what do you think should be done, or how do you deal if federal policy then creates an obstacle in trying to move forward with what you're trying to accomplish? For example, in Guam, our strength is our geographic location. And so we have an increased military buildup, tourism is very strong, and we are booming in construction, but we don't have the labor force to meet for the demand, and we use H-2 workers primarily from the Philippines. And the United States immigration has denied our petitions for H-2 workers, and now has recently made the announcement that the Philippines is out of the eligible countries for H-2B workers. So we have gone from 3,000 workers to now 0. So how do you deal with that, where the federal government is saying, oh, Guam, we support you in the military buildup, you know, we want to help you, give you the resources, but then creates a policy that just is an obstacle to moving forward?
I would just say two things very quickly. One is things on certain types of visas will only be solved, I'm afraid, as part of a comprehensive deal on immigration, unless you can hive off some issues. But let me try to connect it to the conversation this morning. If we don't get this issue right, I actually think it creates a political context in which it's far more difficult to tackle immigration issues. Just think about it. To the extent we have large-scale, prolonged unemployment, how much more difficult trying to get immigration reform through will be the body politic. I actually think the only chance you have to tee this issue up correctly is if we do not have a society which is suffering from prolonged, large-scale unemployment. Then at least you have a chance to shape that debate. Otherwise, I think people will say, how can we even talk about opening up for more people coming in if we have millions and millions of Americans who aren't employed? And even if we have millions of open jobs like we do now that we can't fill, I still don't think you can win that debate if we have a large-scale unemployment problem.
I'm just going to put a plug in here for immigration reform and just say, you know, we're shooting ourselves in the foot right now. What I see is, and I'll take it, particularly in the technology companies sitting on the board of Microsoft, what's happening is because of our immigration policy, and this is the loss to your states, to our states, which is we're not letting in the high-skilled worker, the construction worker or the technology worker. And so what's happened is on our border, we've got Canada with a very progressive immigration policy. And so you're seeing American companies setting up American technology centers in Vancouver and Toronto. Toronto is growing at 1% a year. I would submit for, you know, Illinois or Michigan or any of these places, I mean, those are workers that are working for companies that would be here in the United States but for our immigration policy. And so, you know, I would also suggest you as governor should come together and talk about, you know, we know those high-tech jobs are very good paying jobs. There's a huge positive impact on your entire population. You know, we need a more thoughtful approach, and you all sit at the front door of that possibility being in your states or not.
Other questions? Governor Sisolak.
Is it on? Oh, there we go. I've got a question, I guess it's directed towards a comment that James and Deborah made relating to the community colleges, and I agree wholeheartedly the career technical aspect of that. How do you deal with the ability to bring in faculty that aren't your traditional faculty? They want a tradesman that's a welder, not a faculty member that necessarily has a 4-year teaching degree, but they want to be able to teach the skill that's being disseminated, whether it's welding or HVAC or plumbing or whatever. How do you overcome that licensure issue?
That is a fundamental issue we heard about all over the country. Most recently in San Bernardino, California, which I think many of you know of. I grew up right near there, where they have some of the most ambitious high schools in the entire state in this very troubled city of San Bernardino. And the main limiting factor they have now is on these high schools where it's 100% sort of free and reduced lunch for the students. They're only about 20% white, but they have 7 career academies that all students go through, is getting professionally equipped educators to go in there. And so I think this is something where governors do have more leverage than, for example, on immigration issues. You know, immigration is out of your hands, but licensure should be at least within your influence to some degree, to make it part of the bully pulpit, to work with the legislature to change it, because I assume a lot of these are state-based regulations as opposed to federal ones. So if you make this a priority, and it seems to have a lot of appeal. So I say Godspeed.
And just one illustration of how important this is and why it's working at the high school level. Arroyo Valley High School in San Bernardino, in 2010, it's this high skills track high school. 2010, their graduation rate was 62%. In 2018, after these programs were up and running, it was 98%.
Secretary.
I would suggest, I would look at places like Wichita. Delaware has some good programs. Colorado, where they've changed laws so that you're able, as a teacher, to become, even though you're not credentialed, let's say, in the academic field, that you have to change basically state regulations and state laws that say, no, we can actually have, let's call it, someone who is proficient in an area become a lecturer, if you will, and it's creating new categories of what can be a teacher. For example, in Wichita, they created a position called a research scientist, which is not necessarily a professor in their university system, but allowed them to bring in people from industry who are actually doing the type of training that you're talking about, Governor. So I think it's partially to look at your own state laws and state regulations and work with your university or your community college to say, okay, what are the rules that are preventing us from bringing in that qualified trainer, if you will?
Can I just ask you a question? Which is,
oh, go ahead.
Listening to this conversation, and I'm not an expert on this part of it, but one of the things that I keep hearing is there are success stories around the country. I don't know to what extent you've got best practices exchanges in every area we're talking about, from teacher credentialing to workforce retraining. It could be on Medicare or Medicaid reform. But I would just think that to the extent there are truly up-to-date, comprehensive best practices exchanges that every governor and his or her staffs have access to, that would be fantastic. And that's something that you all could really bring about.
You bet. And I mean, our successes are often from stealing from our neighbors and others. And there is the NGA.
We try to avoid that in academia. Go ahead.
Yeah, good idea. The NGA does have a Center for Best Practices, and also fundamentally what we're doing up here today even, we both want to draw from experts, and by the end of this, we're going to be drawing from what other states are doing.
Good.
I think we have time for one last question. Governor Herbert from Utah.
Well, thank you, and thanks to the panel. We appreciate you coming to inform us on this issue. I know that it was mentioned, and I think states, by the way, to answer your question, James, I think states are being forced by the market to make allowances and adjustments. It was mentioned earlier that technology is destroying jobs. And as I look at the history, it looks like there's always been a constant state of disruption. We have moved from agriculture, as has been mentioned, James, to more urbanized areas. That seems to be happening all over the country. So disruption's been there, and education and training skills seem to be a key issue. It looks to me like this is maybe just another chapter of the same book. And so what is different about today as opposed to the disruption that happened 200 years ago or 100 years ago or 50 years ago, the Industrial Revolution, now IT and high tech? I mean, constant disruption in the marketplace. What's so different about today? Why is there such a sense of urgency today different than what we've had in past generations?
Richard and I may have complementary views on this. Richard, you can go, and then I will have the rebuttal stage. Please, go ahead.
I think there are some important differences, but I take your intellectual point. We've gone through economic, social, technological transitions. I think this one is happening faster. I think it is not limited to any particular sector. It's repetitive jobs, it's intellectual, it's white collar, blue collar, and every other collar you can think of, so it's much broader in the society. I also think the skill levels of the jobs being displaced, what are coming on stream are far higher skill levels, so the training and education differential is significant. And I also think AI is something particularly different. It's qualitatively different in the kinds of tasks and the quality of the performance. So I think, in a funny sort of way, to see this as simply but the latest chapter of a challenge, my guess is that's probably too sanguine. I hope you're right, but my prediction is you're not. And in any case, in terms of public policy, we ought not to assume you're right. I don't think we have that luxury. I think we ought to assume this is qualitatively different and qualitatively more difficult, and in any event, different and unique, and we ought to think about what it will take people to live in a world where millions of truck driving jobs, Uber drives, and taxi drivers, those jobs are eliminated. Most repetitive industrial tasks are taken over by robots. And again, a full range of jobs from reading MRIs and X-rays to possibly what thousands and thousands of legal assistants do now in searching briefs are all taken over by AI. So I actually think the impact along the spectrum will be much greater than, say, the agriculture to manufacturing or urbanization transition you mentioned.
James.
My view concisely is closer to yours, and that this has been the story of Western economies, for hundreds of years. But I agree with Richard, the speed is unusual in this case, and that it's worth thinking about how to buffer the effects. Because again, is the GI Bill versus 1930s comparison, there are ways in which you can make for a better or worse transition, but I agree, economic life is constant change, and the story for regions, for individuals, for families, for companies is being able to adapt to that.
There's one other thing that's qualitatively different now. It's the degree of globalization. This is not simply an American phenomenon. We are 5%, 4% of the world's people. We're now roughly 19% of the world's economy. Our share is going down. We look at the massive investments in places like China and elsewhere. We are going to be playing on a much broader field in terms of competition than we did, for example, when we were switching from an agricultural-based economy to a more manufacturing-based economy.
And I would just say the consequence of this, as I see it, is that the basic education that we're offering our population is inadequate for the fundamental jobs that are going to exist, not the most specialized jobs. I'm talking about the fundamental jobs. And the kind of skills that are being taught in our grade schools and our high schools. You talk to businesses and they will say, unless you begin that in high school, I can't, I don't want to do that in college, or it's too late for an individual to gain, Kubernetes skills or things like that. So it becomes, I think we have to really rethink our entire education system. And as Richard and both Jim said, the pace is extraordinary. I mean, you talk to Bank of America, they had 315,000 employees in 2011, and today they have 200,000. And most of those jobs have been automated, and they're white-collar jobs.
Let me just say, I think most of us understand it's a global marketplace. The expansion that's taking place is, in fact, significant. That's certainly a factor. But again, I think states are, in fact, reacting to these pressures. I know in Utah, at least, we have lifelong learning approaches. We have more people going to college now, and particularly emphasizing technical education. One-year certificates, two-year certificates, associate degrees, more getting post-high school education, more counseling in our schools to make sure that we have alignment with what's being taught and a pathway forward for us to be not only career but college preparation. And again, realizing that the marketplace is changing and moving and dynamic, and we need to run to keep up. So I think some of those pressures you're talking about are actually happening, and I don't think Utah's alone in that. We're trying to reflect this demands that are out there, education, because that, to me, is the key. If you've got the skills and all those disruption and displacement of jobs, other jobs are being created because of that disruption. And we need to understand that and be in alignment with what the marketplace is allowing to happen.
Okay. To each of you, thank you for both your thought-provoking discussions, your reactions, but also the good work that you're doing to make sure that there are good jobs for all Americans. Please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you. It's great.
I so appreciate it.
The National Governors Association offers an enormous amount of services to governors, their cabinet secretaries, and their staffs. And it's really important to know that while we do major meetings to get governors together, and that's very important, NGA is so much more.
What National Governors Association does is the politics are over. Now let's work on running our states for the improvement of the citizens that we get to serve.
I tell governors, we may not know the answer, we can find the people right away who do know the answer.
The peer group of our nation's governors are pretty darn small, meaning that we have one for each state and territory. And the ability of NGA, both the convening functions for governors to actually get together, share best practices, steal ideas, that is unrivaled, and there's no other avenue to be able to do that.
And the beautiful thing is, you really can't tell who the Republicans and the Democrats are. I mean, if I didn't have a scorecard with the new governors, I wouldn't have any idea.
I think we're all in here to try and get our agenda going, get our initiatives going. And, you know, it doesn't matter to me whether you're Republican or Democrats. Good ideas come from everybody.
I'm a pragmatist, so I love that. It's just picking brains from what's happening and what's working in other states. We're just having a great time and learning the issues and coming up with best practices.
Your fellow governors are essentially a mobile think tank. Being able to call another governor is gold. And, you know, without the NGA, I wouldn't have anywhere near the relationships with other governors that I have today.
One of the conversations I had was with Governor Hickenlooper. He turned me on to someone who might be a really good fit for my cabinet. That connection was made, and it wouldn't have been if I hadn't been here.
Not only is it great for the governors to get together and share input and advice, but for the staffs to share best practices and to hear about what it's been like in a different state. How did you deal with this problem or that issue? It's a big part people don't think about. They think it's just the governors that get together, but that's just as valuable.
When you say making life multiplanetary.
Yeah, America is a nation of explorers.
One of the things that the NGA does very well is bring people together, people who work for governors, but also people in the private sector.
The difference with NGA is that the governor's staff that attend, they go very deep on policy issues, and they're, in some ways, you know, the closest you're going to get to the governor. I mean, I always think sometimes staff is better than the governor himself because the governor's dealing with a lot of other things. And a company like Microsoft, we really care about public policy. We care about lots of issues that don't involve us selling to the government.
Broadband has become the electricity of the 21st century.
Sometimes I spend an afternoon meeting with 5 or 6 people that have been lined up by the NGA, and I come around saying, wow, if we'd had to do that ourselves, the amount of the hundreds of hours of building all those relationships to set up those kinds of meetings would have been prohibitive.
Having a National Governors Association allows for the private sector and corporate partners to really interact over time.
That's what a blockchain is. It is just a distributed ledger. We all have a copy.
And be able to share the types of activities, projects, programs, and services that the private sector can offer to states. We've been very fortunate that we've had, for example, the president of Ghana, prime ministers from places like Australia and Canada. And what governors find is they learn from those countries, but they also develop relationships.
There are a lot of countries out there that want to do business in the U.S., but they don't know how to do it. And so we wanted to create a clearinghouse with NGA Global that the governments from other places who want to conduct trade missions that come to the U.S. could come to the NGA and they could point them in the right direction.
This is an opportunity in one place to get access to a lot of really important people that may help you do more business and create more jobs in your state.
NGA is really a college for governors that is offering continuing education all the time, where you can learn from your classmates, learn from your professors, and be a better governor.
Wow, packed.
All right. Well, somebody worked hard on that video, so maybe give them a round of applause. That's a lot of work. My name is Van Jones, and you may see me on CNN sometimes. I am also the CEO of a new organization called the Reform Alliance. Jay-Z and Meek Mill and about 6 billionaires have decided that they want to help make criminal justice more possible and more powerful. So I'm happy to be here representing the Reform Alliance. And we are going to have a discussion about an issue that probably, even as recently as 5 years ago, would not have been considered a top issue, but has become probably the most dynamic issue on a bipartisan basis in the country, which is criminal justice reform. And as governors, you have a tremendous opportunity to make a huge difference, because about 90% of all the people who are locked up at the state and local level. 95% of them are coming home. And so the decisions that are made by governors are going to have a massive impact on whether they come home better or bitter, and whether they succeed or fail. And so what we wanted to do was to have a conversation with some of the leaders in this space. Governor Bryant from Mississippi. You don't think of Mississippi as a place where a lot of reform in this area would be happening, and yet under your leadership it is. We want to hear from you. We also have Governor Wolf from Pennsylvania, who is leading a red-blue effort in his state to get a lot done. Meek Mill's case really lifted up some of the issues there. I'm sure you'll talk about that around probation and parole reform. And also Mark Holden is here from Koch Industries. We've been doing this sort of left-right thing together for a couple of years. So just welcome this panel. We're going to have a great discussion. Why don't we start with you, actually, Governor Wolf? Obviously, Meek Mill got sent back to prison for a really minor little non-crime infraction, and that turned into a whole global movement around doing something on probation and parole reform, an issue people hadn't really thought that much about. And now you've become an outspoken champion on that issue and so many more. Why have you taken up this issue of criminal justice reform?
Well, it's an important issue, and as you point out, it's absolutely bipartisan. And I think the reason for that is that it is wrong, and I think people recognize it's wrong to basically exclude folks from the economy, from our society, from our neighborhoods for a lifetime simply because they might have made a mistake early on. You mentioned Meek Mill, who's from Pennsylvania, was consigned to, 14 years of probation, and his last infraction was popping a wheelie. That's the kind of thing that is just wrong. But it's also not very smart. We exclude those folks from our economy. We exclude them from gaining good jobs in our businesses, paying taxes, helping our revenues. It also costs a heck of a lot of money to incarcerate them. In Pennsylvania, we're big drop in our prison population, and it has saved us a lot of money in our fiscal record. But one final thing, I've been in politics for 4 years. Before that, I was in business. And like most business people, for most of the time I was in business, I automatically excluded anybody who had any brush with the law. We did a background check. You had a record, you did anything, you were out. We didn't even interview you. And we decided in maybe 6, 7 years ago to say, let's give a second chance here, see what happens. We think we might actually get better employees. And this was during the recession. We didn't have to do that. We had plenty of people applying for jobs. And we found that they made better employees.
Wow.
And so,
why do you think that is? Why do you think that
they're trying to prove something? I
they
mean,
have got something to prove?
You interview everybody, and you make your best judgment. But this group is a self-selected group, and so we found that we actually did better with the second chance folks than we did with a random, giving them, the interviews and holding them to very high standards. We actually did better with our second chance folks. So this is the right thing to do, but it's also the smart thing from a fiscal point of view, and it's a smart thing to do from a business point of view.
Yeah, Governor, I want to bring you into this. A lot of people have talked about the First Step Act, which I was proud to play a role in, along with Cut 50 and Coke and a bunch of other folks. People did not know that we had a secret weapon in convincing Donald Trump that this was smart policy. And that secret weapon is sitting to my left, only physically to my left. Can you talk a little bit about how do you convince, and how did you convince, as such a strong conservative, your legislature, your community, and the President of the United States that now is the time for criminal justice reform?
I think it helped being a conservative. I think it helped being a former law enforcement officer. I'm a Republican, conservative, former law enforcement officer. I was raised a Baptist, married a Methodist girl, and I believe in this movement. So when people come up to you, governors, and they say, oh, that's that sort of soft on crime, hug a thug thing, it was hard for them to tell me that.
Yeah.
I put a lot of people in jail, and I found out doing that they have families, and they have mothers, and they have children. And so there is a world that they live in that sometimes we could not comprehend. And so we went to Bedminster, Jared Kushner called me and said, we want you to come up here, we're going to have a little meeting on criminal justice reform. I said, well, that's just my thing. We did it in 2014 in the state of Mississippi, and everybody looked and said, that's impossible. There's no way that you're going to have corrections reform in Mississippi in 2014. And I had legislator after legislator come into my office, and we had counseling sessions, and we had prayer. And they just said, Governor, I can't vote for this and go back to Jones County. I'm just going to get killed over it. And I said, I'm going to call your sheriff right now because his jail's full. And he's having to pay for everybody in that jail. And a lot of them made stupid mistakes. There are people that need to be in prison. And then there are people we're just mad at. If they go do something wrong, maybe they're taking drugs and they get trapped in that cycle of addiction, they break into your car, you're mad at them. Do they need to be in jail for 20 years? No. So we went to Bedminster, and I remember sitting in that room, and we had Governor Perry there, and just a very small group of us that were there in the room, and the president came in, and he said, all right, Jared, you got me here. I really don't want to do this. And Jared said, well, Mr. President, I'm so excited we're here. We have a very entertaining opportunity here, and I want to turn this over to Phil. And that's how we got started. And for the next hour, the president was sort of, no. And he has a big heart. I know he has a big heart. And after the meeting, I went and talked to him and said, you're the only president that can do this. You're the only guy that can do this. President Obama couldn't have done it because, quite honestly, a lot of us probably would have, people would have screamed and hollered, oh my goodness, he's going to turn them all out on our communities, and it's going to be pillaging and crime, and there they go again. But when Donald Trump was able to do it, along with Mark and his team there at Coke and other conservatives, like Rick Perry and other governors across the country, people said, let me listen to this. Maybe I need to stop shouting and listen a little bit. And it's just been absolutely remarkable. And it was an evolution of the president. It was him calling and saying, Phil, let's talk about this again. And Jared Kushner just never giving up. And I think it's one of the most important things he will ever do. I know it's one of the most important things. We have another bill in front of us now, the Next Step Act in Mississippi. So I can let those that are coming out get a driver's license. And so professional licensure, so they're not automatically excluded when they walk in to try to get a contractor's license. And they said, oh, you've been in jail? Get out of here. Nope. So we're going to pass a law that says you can't do that. They have to have equal opportunity to apply for that license and maintain that license. A lot of those that are in prison today.
That's a real big deal. That's a real big deal.
A lot of them in prison today served in the United States military. So they wore the cloth of the nation. And we're not going to turn our back on them because they made a mistake. That's what I told the president. That's how it works.
Hey, listen, brother.
Yeah.
Hey, listen, man. You know, there's something about this issue that is bringing out the best in both political parties. It's bringing out the best in all races and classes of people. There's just something about realizing that we are not who we say we are when we say that it's liberty and justice for all. Republicans believe in liberty, limited government, individual respect and dignity. Mass incarceration is running over that principle now. Democrats believe in justice, sticking up for the little people, that kind of stuff. The justice part's good, but liberty and justice for all is getting disrespected now by too much incarceration. And you have been, Mark, a voice early calling attention to this among libertarians and conservatives. Talk to us about this and First Step and anything else you want to talk about.
Well, thank you, Van, and thanks for having me here today. So this is an issue that we've been focused on at Koch for a long time. We very much are focused on barriers to success, people who are kept from being able to succeed, whether it's education systems that don't work, or like the governor mentioned, occupational licensing that is a cronyist system. But at the end of the day, in my opinion, the criminal justice system is the biggest barrier to opportunity for millions and millions and millions of Americans, and it has been forever. And so I'm with Koch Industries, so we see a lot of failed big government programs. Sorry, everybody, but we just do out there. And I would say that the criminal justice system is among the biggest failed big government program. It's a pay-to-play system. As Brian Stevenson says, if you're rich and guilty, you get a better deal than if you're poor and innocent. That's fundamentally unjust, just at the headline, right? So we look at it as a situation. We need a criminal justice system. There are people, as the governors have said, who need to be in prison for a time. Some may be longer, some may be shorter. But everybody's coming out. And the whole idea is that we have a system that really respects public safety. And we have a system that's based on equal rights and equal justice. And then the last piece, we need a redemptive system, one that provides second chances. And we look at it from a moral perspective that we've already talked about. The constitutional perspective, it's amazing how much is in the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, about criminal justice reform. 40% of it deals with that. Bail reform was pretty much something that we're talking about now, but the founders got it immediately right, which is it shouldn't be excessive. It shouldn't be based on resources. None of this should be. It should be based on risk and safety. And we haven't been doing that for the last 40 or 50 years, unfortunately, because we got derailed by the war on drugs, which is a big issue, but we didn't fight it the right way. It's really tough to declare war and win against an inanimate object when you're talking about people and different aspects of it who clearly some of the people involved need to be incarcerated. But a lot of the people who get caught up in the system are sick, are poor, may have mental health issues, and putting them in prison doesn't do anything. The last piece is the fiscal piece. We've talked about this, and that's why the governors get involved and engaged. And it started in Texas, and there's a number of governors here today that are doing the same thing now, and I'm really reluctant to start naming them because I'll leave someone out, but we've got from Louisiana, Governor Bell Edwards, we've got Governor Burgum from North Dakota, we've got many, many others here, Governor Bevin, et cetera. And the reality is it started, like I said, in Texas, and what Texas has shown, that being smart on crime, not tough on crime, not soft on crime, smart on crime and soft on taxpayers is the way to go. And you're able to, like they have, reduce their crime rate to they haven't seen this low since the 1960s. And that led, after that, they've closed down 8 prisons, saved billions of dollars. Bottom line is, many other governors, left and right, have gotten engaged and involved in this now because it's good stuff. And they all come in for the savings, but more importantly, they stay for the salvation, because that's where the good stuff is. And that's what we're seeing.
Amen, brother.
Yeah, that's what it is.
Preach it.
But when you say they come in for the savings, they come in on the fiscal question.
Exactly.
But they stay for the salvation. What do you mean by the salvation?
If you've ever seen, for example, Governor Deal, former Governor Deal, I've seen him speak 4 times, and he's crying every time about it, what he did. And he's rock rib conservative, you know what I mean, all that stuff. And he talks about seeing these individuals who come into prison, who are just lost and broken, and then they come out better because there are education programs. They're getting drug therapy. They're getting cognitive therapy. They're getting over the trauma that many of the people in the system suffer from. As many of us know here, most of the people in the criminal justice system, again, there are people that need to be there, I'm not saying otherwise, but the overwhelming majority come from really tough backgrounds. And so dealing with all that trauma, dealing with all that, what Governor Deal has seen and what we've seen now coming into the federal system is there's a way to make this all work. We put people in who need to become better while in prison. So we'll have prison reform. We will have education programs, we'll have vocational programs, we'll have therapy, et cetera. People get better while in prison. There are in some places there are incentives. If you do the right thing, you can get out earlier potentially. And then on the other side of it, try to keep the people coming in, slowing down that with common sense sentencing reform, either diversionary programs.
Fewer going in. And
fewer going in, others who are going in are getting better, coming out better, not being returned. And so that's the whole idea. And that's why Texas has been able to close prisons. That's why other states have been able to do it. And we're at an all-time high for safety in this country. That doesn't mean there aren't issues that we need to deal with, but we can deal with them better when we're not locking everybody up. Last thing I'll say, the First Step Act is a first step, but it's a huge first step at the federal level. When you've never done anything before in the federal system to make the system less punitive, more redemptive, and more restorative, and give people chances like this, second chances, it's a big deal. And we're very excited about it, but there's more to come with the First Step Act. And the most important thing that has to happen, I think, is obviously it needs to be implemented right. And we're going to be on top of that, as I know you and your team are as well. But at the end of the day, going back to what I'd like to say last thing, I'm sorry, I keep saying last thing. What Governor Wolf was talking about, we have hired people with criminal records at Coke since I've been at Coke, which is going on 24 years. And for us, it's the right thing to do. We think it's a good thing to do. It helps people. But for us, it makes a lot of business sense. And here's what I mean. There's an estimate 1 in 3 people in this country have some type of criminal record. So if you're going to use a box on your application to say, I can't even look at this person, I'm going to judge him by this one piece of paper that says he had a criminal record, you're going to throw it in the trash can, that doesn't make sense to us to reduce your applicant pool by 1/3. And so what we've seen is by hiring people, giving people a chance to explain their situation, that's one data point to look at. We've got a lot of people who need a second chance, who are hungry and humble, like the governor said. And in some places, they're our best employees. And I always get questions, well, won't you have to do your diligence? Aren't you afraid about this or that? In this day and age, you need to do your diligence whenever you hire, make any hiring decision. We've hired people who have the best credentials, and then they screw up, they steal stuff. And then we hired people with criminal records who are so hungry and just want to do the right thing. And so for us, we just see it as a win-win-win. It's good for the employer, good for the individual, and then good for society, because you got someone coming back in who's not going to be a threat to public safety. That keeps law enforcement safer, makes their communities better, enriches all of us, and then become taxpayers.
Yeah, good. I want to come back to you. We mentioned the business thing. Part of the thing that I've been observing, I had a TV show called Crossfire with a guy named Newt Gingrich. And it was called Crossfire because we did not agree on almost anything. But we discovered that we agreed on this issue. And we began working together, and that's how I met you and the whole deal. And there's this kind of growing, almost secret society or sorority, fraternity of people who are very strong partisans. This is not the kind of bipartisanship for the mushy middle. This is the bipartisanship of the wings, very, very strong partisans, but who just feel that our values in both parties are not being respected by what we're doing. And it seems to me, Governor, that some people focus on sentencing reform, fewer people going in. Some people focus on prison reform, making sure the prisons are making people better and not bitter. Other people focus on reentry, making sure when people come home they have second chances. But it almost doesn't matter where you start. At some point, you are going to want to see more done throughout the system. You are, I think, uniquely positioned to lead on this reentry effort as a business leader, as somebody who cares about probation and parole. Can you talk about two things for us? One is, I think most people don't know how broken the probation and parole system has become. There's 6 million people who are under the control of the criminal justice system. Only 2 million are locked up. 4 million are caught up in this probation and parole system. And you hear, oh, well, this person violated parole. You think they're a carjacker. You can go back to prison for being 15 minutes late for a meeting with your parole officer and lose your house, your jobs, your kids. I mean, I could not survive on probation or parole if I were going to go back to prison for being 15 minutes late. I was 15 minutes late today. So how is this going to get fixed in your state, and you're passionate about that? And what can governments do to help businesses make more of the choices that you decided to make as a business leader on reentry?
So I don't know how many questions were sort of embedded in that.
Just two: probation, parole, and reentry.
I think that, first of all, everything we do in criminal justice reform is a jobs bill. This is about getting people back to work, and we have to look at every aspect of it, from incarceration, sentencing, actually before sentencing, to bail reform. Pennsylvania, I think, is the first state in the country, is still the only state with clean slate legislation. We'll seal your record so that that's not in your permanent record when you go to apply for a job. But one of the key things, as we've seen with Meek Mill and others, is the issue of putting a cap on probation, the period when you're in probation. First of all, we have to do a lot of things to make sure the time you're in probation is important, and that you actually, it does contribute to the restorative function of the criminal justice system. But after 3 years, it doesn't matter what you're doing, it's not going to work any better. So 3 to 5 years seems to be where most states are in terms of caps. Some are higher than that. Pennsylvania is one of the few states without any cap, which means that someone like Meek Mill, who does a wheelie, and the judge just apparently doesn't like Meek Mill, you end up with 14 years being on probation and no end in sight for doing a wheelie in some place outside of Pennsylvania. So I'm not even sure why that would matter in any case, but it certainly doesn't help Meek Mill, who is ready and able to make a great contribution to our society. It doesn't help anybody who's in a position to get back into the swing of things, help their family, help their community, help their economy. All those things are thwarted by having a bad criminal justice system. It's a jobs bill. Everything we do, no matter what stage, it's a jobs bill.
That's great. I'm stealing that. That's great.
I stole it too.
You stole it too?
I stole it.
We're going to go to Q&A in a second, so I'm sure you guys have a lot more questions and that kind of stuff. But, help me understand your passion for this. I mean, you really have been one of the few people who make such a, you transitioned from business, you went right from business to being in charge of a state. You've been incredibly pragmatic, incredibly effective. You were reelected. Why is this so key for you as an issue? And what would you say to other people who are in elective office about taking on this challenge?
Well, I think, as we've all said, this is the holy grail of politics. You can bring extreme right, extreme left together because it's not only fair, it's smart. And it actually gets people back into the economy. That helps all of it reduces the prison population. That's expensive, over $40,000 per person in Pennsylvania. We've reduced it by $4,500. And we're still working. Our crime rate is down. We can close prisons. We can do things that actually takes the money from that, which is not a very good investment, to things like schools, to things like roads and bridges, and things that actually make lives better. That's really important. And I don't think anybody, whether you're right, left, could look at this and say, I don't think I really like the outcome here. I mean, what's not to like? You have more people working. You have more people who are employable. You have more tax revenue. You have fewer expenses. It's something that brings us all together in a moment of unity.
Now that the public safety question has been addressed, in other words, you got 35 states now that have seen a reduction in their prison population and a reduction in the crime rate at the same time. So suddenly, you're not by yourself if you say, well, let's see if we can keep moving this thing forward. I know that there are questions, and I believe there's an opportunity for you to ask some. We've got a very strong, pragmatic Democratic governor up here. We've got a very rock-wib conservative governor up here. Both have been able to find, you got a red-blue state, you got a red state. And both of it.
And, as we were just talking to the governor, we reduced our prison population by 11%, saved $46 million. Now, you want to get a legislator's attention, you bring in $46 million he didn't have. So what we're doing now is the next bill, the next step in Mississippi, will be to make sure that they invest that in a reentry program. Because they took it, rightfully so, they're appropriators. I was in the legislature, nothing better than being able to spend money helping education, transportation, law enforcement. So they were putting that money back into the general fund. And so this year I'm saying, whoa, okay, stop that. Give it back to us. Because I've got to get reentry programs. We've got to get these folks back into the workforce. I've got 41,000 job openings in the state of Mississippi. 41,000. We used to have people looking for jobs, now I got jobs looking for people. And a lot of them made mistakes, and they're going to come back out. They're going to get out. 99% of them, 98% of them are going to get back out. So you have to be prepared to do that. We were talking earlier about how this only works about 30% of the time. About 35 to 50% will commit another crime within 3 years and be back in the system. Any other agency, any other government entity that would come in and say, Governor, I need some more money because I'm productive 30% of the time. We'd say, get out of here. No, I'm going to fire you and hire somebody that can run that thing. But that's what we do. And we just sort of were ignoring it. So 11% reduction, $46 million, and our crime rate's gone down. What's not to like about this? Now, there's going to be mistakes. Some knucklehead's going to get out of prison and go commit a violent crime. It's going to happen. Get ready. And our friends in the media are going to come running and say, this is one of the guys that got out because you had reform in criminal justice. And so you have to own it. You have to own it. You can't say, you know, well, you have to say, absolutely. And I'm sorry. It's dreadful. It breaks my heart that that happened. But look at all the other thousands that are out working, that are taking care of their children, the moms that are back in their homes with their families. So go talk to them. But you're going to find out, and it's going to happen. Just suck it up and keep moving. Because as I told the president, I think at the end of the day, it's all about this. It's the right thing to do. It is just the right thing to do.
Well said. You know, nobody gets in trouble when we hold them in there for 20 years and send them out more traumatized, and then they do something bad. We say, well, that's on them. So I think those of you who are trying to send them home better deserve more.
And then we put a fine on them, so we put them in debtor's prison. We say, after you get out of prison, you got to pay off your $10,000 fine. How's that going to work? He's been in prison for the last 4 or 5 years, and he can't get out until he pays his fine. So we did away with what I call debtor's prison in Mississippi.
Well, we appreciate you. Governor Scott. Absolutely.
I'm curious what you're doing in other states in terms of youthful offenders. I mean, we're going through that right now, and we're at a crossroads about where we go in the future with this particular program. So I'm just curious what you're finding throughout the states.
Yeah, you're talking about
youthful offenders, yeah.
Yeah, I think criminal justice reform knows no age boundaries. We've got to do a better job throughout. But one of the areas, I think, that in one of the many areas, bail reform. You can go to jail in most states now if you're arrested. You're not guilty of anything, but you've been arrested, and the judge says, okay, $50 bail. Well, you don't have $50. You're 15 years old. And so you get in jail you're put in jail until the trial comes up. In some places that can take months. That's debtor's prison. That's even worse than here you haven't done anything, and you're in jail simply because you can't come up with $50. I think there are a lot of things that we can do to make the system fair, so that whether you're a young person, whether you're middle-aged, whether you're an old person, you aren't going to be trapped in any way by a system that should be trying to get you back on your feet rather than hold you and warehouse you.
And we found most of that is mental and social issues. So you've got to get them to a mental health center somewhere. Get a mental health professional with that child. You get 16-year-old kids that are breaking into houses, that are committing crimes. There's something going on in his life that's really ugly. My children didn't do that. A lot of children don't do that because they have wonderful homes and they have parents that care about them, and they get up on Sunday mornings and go to church, and those children don't. They didn't get to do that. And so we are working really hard. I mean, immediately I went to our Department of Mental Health and said, you got help here, because these children are just lost. We created the Child Protection Services, a whole new agency. Try that as a Republican. And say, I've got to have an entire agency that does nothing but worry about children every day. I got a Supreme Court justice to leave the Mississippi Supreme Court and come chair that be director of that agency. So our adoptions have doubled in the last 2 years. We made it a lot easier for people to adopt children. And then we pour as much counseling as we can into their lives. That's the only way you're going to help turn that around.
Can I say one thing? I'm sorry.
Well,
We got another question.
Yeah, you can answer it when you, as you answer Governor Brown's question. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry.
Thank you very much. In Oregon last year, we were able to use data to reduce some possession of controlled substances penalties from a felony to misdemeanor because we saw very clearly its impact on African American and Latino men. And I'd love to hear from the panel experiences you've had in terms of tackling this issue from a race-based perspective. We know that obviously the impacts for men of color are devastating for women of color as well, and I'd love to hear your thoughts and how we can attack the problem from that perspective.
Well, I think decriminalization of possession, I think what you've done is really important. But I think going beyond that, just a broader look at mandatory minimum sentences. The Republican senator who supported really draconian mandatory minimum sentences in Pennsylvania had a conversion and is now in favor of moving away from that. I think we need to actually move back from the stuff we were doing 20 years ago in this country across the board, not just in possession of small amounts of things like marijuana, but decriminalize a lot of activities that really should not have been criminalized in the first place.
Governor Herbert?
Again, thank you to the panel. I think this is a very important issue. Let me make an observation and then a question. One, I appreciate the fact that Congress is finally catching up with the states.
Takes them a little while.
And we had an initiative a few years ago talking about the states that really are finding solutions to people's problems, because we are actually engaged. It doesn't matter whether you're a red state or a blue state or a purple state. States are leading the way. And I'd hope that in all of our different respective opportunities and roles to have forums, particularly those of you in the media, will have an opportunity to say, look to the states. They're the ones that are finding the solutions to the problems that we have in this country and are probably the best hope for the future of this country. We're not as dysfunctional as we see in Washington, D.C. We actually
That's a very low bar, sir.
I know. Unfortunately, it's the only bar we've got, and it is unfortunate. But states are doing a great job, and I know that criminal justice reform, we passed our bill 3 years ago. Before that, we had mental health courts, drug courts. We've done a lot in trying to find ways to treat and rehabilitate people as opposed to warehousing. And again, I know that's probably a common statement for most of the states here. My question is, what are we doing, and what are you doing, respectively, in the states, the governors, to reduce recidivism? Once you're in the prison system, even if it's a short period of time, how are we helping people to transform back into civilian life and not have this revolving door of recidivism, which we see too much in the criminal justice system?
One, first you got to get them clean and sober. I remember telling the president, the first thing we've got to do is get drugs out of the prisons. And people that don't know it sort of look surprised, like, they're getting drugs? Oh yeah, they get drugs in prison. So you got to get them clean and sober. That's the first thing. And then a really designed reentry programs we talked about earlier. So the way we had prison designed for the longest time, it's a miracle that anybody made it. Because we did everything in the world to keep you from getting back out, finding a job, being able to support your family, and staying out of trouble. We wouldn't let you have a driver's license in Mississippi. We wouldn't even let you go hunt. That's really torture. So you couldn't get a job. There was a box there, you know, have you ever been convicted? Yep, well, thank you very much. We wouldn't let you get a plumber's license. We did everything. We just said, what else can we do to make sure that guy coming out never gets back? 99%, about probably 98% of the women in prison, drug-related. One of the things, Governor Brown, I wanted to talk to, I'll tell you what really got a lot of people's attention, opioids. So we started putting people's neighbors and sons and fathers in jail for opioid. So now it's just not the guy in the alley with some drugs. It's the guy next door that's getting arrested for a bad script and trying to get more opioids. So, oh, okay, wait a minute. Our guys are getting arrested. Oh, we need to do something about this. Yeah, welcome. Yeah. Welcome. Come on in. Yeah. So, and trying to make sure in prison they're not assaulted, because sexual assault, it was so prevalent, and imagine the horrors of that. So making sure that you try to make prison a safer place, a drug-free place, and a place that people can learn, get their GED, learn how to weld. I've got inmates right now welding, and they're really good. And Ingalls came in and said, I'll hire every one of them to build warships in Pascagoula, Mississippi. That's how bad we need welders. They're doing a heck of a job. And when they get out, they got a job. So they go get their driver's license. They go right down there. They get certified as a master marine welder, and they're making $50,000 a year. Does he want to go back to prison? No.
No way.
Let me just, two easy things you can do immediately. One is Medicaid takes 90 days to get on. We used to terminate people because when they come into the prison system, we have our own healthcare system. It would take them 90 days to get back on Medicaid. We simply went to suspending it rather than terminating. And then they could get back on Medicaid the day they came out. If you don't do that, for 3 months, basically, if you have a substance use disorder problem, you're going to be a real candidate for coming right back to prison. Second thing is we started giving them identification, IDs. If you don't have an ID, those are two things you could do immediately, and it would really help the recidivism.
That's good. Look, I know Governor Russell wants to get in. Are you trying to get into, Governor? All right, so look, let's just take, let's take these last two questions from the governors, and then we'll answer them both at one time. Go ahead, Governor.
Okay, well, thank you for the great discussion. Many thoughts, but as I was hearing the discussion, our previous panel was about workforce development. And it seems like these two conversations need to mesh together. In Puerto Rico, we have a task force working on the concept of prisons as education systems. And I wanted to first, seeing sort of the pipeline that all of you have laid out, less people coming in, better people coming out. There's a little pragmatic link in between that's worrisome and that I'm seeing in Puerto Rico, which is sort of the connection. Once you get better people out, how do you actually connect them to the business center and how? And so I'll say some of the things that we have on the drawing board, but I really want to get your thoughts on the matter, about how we give or take away incentives to businesses for getting people involved. How, if we're having this broader conversation about education and workforce development and different levels, why wouldn't prisons be just the perfect or a very good pilot ground to make some of these apprenticeship programs start and have a binding commitment after they go on to free society to continue on? So my 3 points are thoughts on that overview of having prisons as a school system, or as schools, as we've been calling, how to actually make that link, because, eventually we want this to be a cultural change, but there's going to have to be some sort of a runway while we sort of force a little bit of that interaction. And lastly, if this shouldn't be really a part of the discussion as well with the labor, with the workforce development.
Okay. Go ahead. There are so many states that are doing this now, but one, and I don't want to take one out of context, but Michigan, in my opinion, is the gold standard. Heidi Washignton is the head of corrections. I see the governor's not here. I know Iowa's doing great work too. And in Michigan, they have an education program that's run by Calvin College, and they get skilled up, or educated, excuse me, first. And the details, the studies show, the statistics show that people who get in-prison education programming are less likely to recidivate, almost 48% less. And for every dollar spent, it defrays up to $6 of future incarceration costs. They also have a vocational village where they have these individuals coming out, skilled up, mechanics, carpenters, electricians, you name it, and they're getting jobs, some of them six-figure jobs, and they're not going back to prison. It's because there was a need for a workforce there, and that need was met. And so that's something that I think every state should try to do. Last thing I'll say about the Michigan experience is that they provide scholarships to the people in prison, their children, for Calvin College, if they want to go to the college, free of charge, if they want to go to college, which is a way to break the cycle as well.
You got called on, and I'm not going to let you get away, Governor Reynolds from Iowa, without saying something, and then you get the last word, Governor.
Well, I'm chomping up the bit over here because I love the conversation that's taking place, and states are making a difference across this country. We, for the last 3 years, have been offering apprenticeship programs in every single institution that we have in the state of Iowa. 24 different apprenticeship programs, 320 people plus are participating. We've had 162 people that have completed. We are holding job fairs within the institutions before they get out so that we can start to make sure that they go right into a job when they leave. We're getting them the driver's license before they leave, so we're working on getting that. We're just trying to eliminate as many barriers that we have. Here's another pilot program that a couple of Iowa is one of the states that are participating with the Department of Corrections, offering Pell Grants to those that are in our institutions. Right now we have 420 inmates that are participating, and get this, they're earning an average GPA of 3.5. So they are taking advantage of it. It's working. We're doing employer liability shield legislation this year as well. But there's so much that's going on, and it's working.
Well, we're proud of you.
Let me just say one thing. To that, but there are a lot of things we can do in the prison system. But to the governor's point, I don't think you need to do anything to encourage employers to employ. What we need to do is do a better job of saying, here's a really good pool of future employees.
Wonderful. Governor Bell Edwards.
Thank you, Van. Louisiana for decades had the nation's highest incarceration rate. In 2017, we passed and I signed into law 10 bills, modeled after what Mississippi had done, Texas had done, and so forth. We've already shed that title, and it's a good thing for the state of Louisiana. But one of the things that's missed is we are actually safer as a result. The crime rate is down. The recidivism rate is down. And what I was going to suggest to others, one of the 10 bills actually requires us to know what the baseline spending was, and 70% of the savings have to go back into the criminal justice reform movement. In fact, the whole act was called the Criminal Justice Reinvestment Act. And almost all of that, not all of it, but almost all of it goes into reentry, because 95% are going to get out. And if you don't have a successful reentry, by definition, you create at least one new victim of crime. And so it's working in Louisiana. I had the pleasure of being at Bedminster. I was the bipartisan part of that meeting.
That's right.
That day. And I will tell you, that was a tremendous experience for me to be able to see folks coming together, and that's how it should work around the country and in our states. But
I agree with you. Well, listen, we are at time. I just wanted to say in closing, this has been a life-changing experience for me. As everybody knows, I'm on the left side of Pluto. You cannot get more progressive than I am. I'm considered to be a progressive in California. You got to work hard to be considered a progressive in the Bay Area. And it's changed my life. I've got friendships I would have never had. My dear colleague Jessica Jackson with Cut 50 was in the Trump White House this week. They were celebrating Black History Month. And President Trump stopped his speech in the middle and reached out to an African-American woman who was one of the first women let out from First Step, and gave her the microphone, and she spoke from her heart. And there were people with red Make America Great hats cheering and crying for this African-American woman who had finally got a chance to come home, because we finally got together and did something.
Amen.
And I'm just telling you, this has changed my life. You know, Jessica Jackson, I always have to give her credit because she's the one that really led our efforts, and let's give her credit. I believe that there's something about this that's bringing us back to who we are as an American people, and both parties are going to be greater for having taken on this challenge. And I just thank this panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will now take a 10-minute break.
10 minutes.
C-SPAN is live at the National Governors Association meeting in Washington, D.C. The governors are taking a 10-minute break before their next panel, but we'll hear from J.P. Morgan Chase & Company CEO Jamie Dimon. He will be discussing public policy and the economy. During this break, we'll show you an earlier panel discussion on the future of jobs in the U.S.
So we've assembled a great panel today to kick off and talk about many of the facets of creating good jobs for all Americans. Secretary Penny Pritzker is an entrepreneur, a civic leader, philanthropist with a wide array of public and private experiences, including Secretary of Commerce, where she led the first ever skilled workforce initiative at the department. She was co-chair of the Council on Foreign Relations Independent Task Force, which recently issued their report. It's called The Work Ahead: Machine Skills and U.S. Leadership in the 21st Century. We're so pleased you could join us today, Secretary.
Thank you, Governor.
Now, Richard Haass, right next, certainly needs no introduction, but for anybody who hasn't had a chance to work with him, he's an American diplomat, an academic, has been president of the Council on Foreign Relations since 2003. Served as Director of Policy Planning for the U.S. Department of State, been a close advisor to former Secretary of State Colin Powell, has a long history of service to our nation's diplomatic corps. And for the last 4 years, Deborah and James Fallows have been traveling through rural America reporting on innovation of all kinds. Their national best-selling book on the project, Our Town's 100,000-Mile Journey into the Heart of America, was published in May. James is a longtime correspondent for The Atlantic magazine, written 12 books, won a National Book Award, worked for 2 years in the White House as President Jimmy Carter's chief speechwriter and as founding chairman of New America. Deborah is a writer and a linguist. She's written extensively on language, education, families, and work, China, and travel for The Atlantic, National Geographic, Slate, the New York Times, and Washington Monthly. James, Deborah, Richard, and Secretary, thank you so much for joining us. Please give them a round of applause. Secretary Pritzker, I'll open it up with you as the co-chair of the Council of Foreign Relations Task Force. And this is something that, when I read, I knew that we had to have you speaking to our overall crew. I know that you and your team came up with a series of recommendations along the way of how we can better link workforce and education. Could you give us a sense of that?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having us here today. You know, Governor, I think the fact that you've made good jobs for all Americans a centerpiece of what you're doing at the NGA is really terrific. Because we all know that the people in our communities are being affected by these seismic forces of innovation, automation, artificial intelligence, and globalization, and that also that the nature of work is changing. What the report is, and there's a slide deck that we've put together for you, governors, is really a menu of opportunities for you to consider policies to implement in your states. Because you as governors sit at the fulcrum point of being able to actually change the opportunity set for the people in your states. And let me just give you a couple of examples of some of the recommendations. First is to begin with a review in your state, which you've done, Governor, in Montana, of, you know, what are the skills gaps that exist? What's the difference between what your business community needs and what is your community colleges, your universities, your high schools offering in terms of training? And that gap analysis is really critical to beginning to set out what's the work plan to address the challenge. And there's companies both in the book and in the handout that we've given you, we've listed, here's who you can go to who will help you do that assessment, whether it's LinkedIn or Burning Glass or EMSI, they'll help your states do this assessment. And they'll give you the data, because you have to start with the best possible data about what are your jobs needs and also what are your community colleges and other training organizations offering. I think second is really recognizing that the community colleges are your leverage point. These institutions are so vital to so many in our communities, particularly those who are at the lower end of the economic spectrum, as well as those who are mid-career and need retraining. And there are organizations that can help you align, what's going on in your community colleges with what's happening, what your businesses need. Again, you as governors are the people who can bring together your educational institutions, your businesses, your NGOs that provide mentorship to address these issues. So there's organizations like Pathways to Prosperity, which I think is out here. They've got a kiosk here, or Skillful, that are working with different governors to make sure that your credentialing system is something that's both relevant but also is stackable and valuable to the worker. And then and I'll put in a shameless plug for Select USA here, which is an organization that I helped found when I was Secretary of Commerce. You want to go out and leverage your workforce investment to bring in new employers. Every governor is a salesperson out selling your state, right? And what Select USA is helping with foreign direct investment. But you've got to go out and say, here, I've got this workforce investment. I have the supply chain that can help support you as a company in your endeavors. And I would suggest one thing is, and our report does, you want a point person in your organization as governor that can quarterback in your administration on workforce and on education and on economic development, because bringing all those disparate parts of your government together to work and be aligned and coordinating the interagency is really tough. Finally, I would just say that our report throws out some really interesting ideas that are being tried by different states. And as I said, the report's really a menu of options, but for example, lifelong learning accounts. Washington State has a pilot going on where they're experimenting with tax advantage accounts where both an employee and employer can set aside money for training. Or Connecticut, Georgia, Virginia, Rhode Island, Kentucky, Mississippi all have a program where they're basically providing worker training tax credits. That's another option available to you. And finally, there's the question of, would you maybe have state-run automatic and individual retirement accounts? Because one of the problems is people are not getting benefits from their some of their jobs, particularly in the gig economy. Anyway, the point of the report, and that's a really fast summary, is there's lots of options, and it's very much targeted to you as governors. And it's something that is meant to be a useful tool for you and your staffs. Obviously, you'll learn from each other. And finally, we put our contact information at the back of it so that the resources that the Council on Foreign Relations made available to develop this menu can be made available to you or your staff or whoever would like to learn more.
And there are so many things in that report that's kind of transformational in the way that we all need to begin to think. Like, I started a future-ready workforce for Montana, just dealing with a cabinet. I mean, a sub-cabinet, and bringing in education and bringing everybody to take a peek at where that can go. And other things like that we need to be doing.
Exactly.
You are not always the most optimistic human being, it seems, Richard, but with regard to the ongoing debate about automation, you do provide, on the one hand, what I'd say is an optimistic view that we're unlikely to face mass unemployment, but you also give us the warning that while technologies can increase the productivity and our quality of life, they only lift all boats if the gains are equally distributed. So how do we make sure that in a changing world that millions of Americans aren't left behind by these changes?
Well, it's the right question, it's the right issue, and you're all to be commended for
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here. I hope everyone's enjoying the NGA Winter Conference so far. I want to first of all begin by introducing my my co-moderator and friend and colleague, the 75th governor of Rhode Island and the very first female governor in state history, Governor Gina Raimondo.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody.
And we're really excited about the session we're going to have here this morning, and we're very pleased to have our very special guest with us today. In 2006, he became the chairman of the board of J.P. Morgan Chase. He served as CEO and president since 2005, formerly served as president chief operating officer following J.P. Morgan Chase's merger with Bank One Corporation in 2004. At Bank One, he was chairman and chief executive officer, previously held numerous executive roles at Citigroup, Travelers Group, Commercial Credit Company, and American Express. He's on the board of directors of Harvard Business School, chairman of the Business Roundtable, a member of the Business Council, and he also serves on the board of trustees of the New York University School of Medicine. So please join me in giving a warm NGA welcome to Jamie Dimon.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for joining us for this discussion. Let's go ahead and get started. First of all, so you led J.P. Morgan since 2004, including successfully leading the bank through the 2008 financial crisis and the recession that followed. And you've had, an unparalleled perspective on the global economy. So I guess I think everybody would love to hear your overall assessment of the state of the U.S. economy.
Okay.
And how industries and workers are weathering disruptions and the rapidly changing technology and globalization.
Okay, thank you. So thrilled to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And I'm going to speak frankly and openly about some of the issues that face this country. I want to give you a short-term and a long-term view about the economy. Okay, the short term is we've grown at 20% for the last 10 years, okay, which is anemic. It's 20% over 10 years. It should have been 40. And so I think one of the questions you have to ask is why has it been so slow in a normal recovery? But we still are growing at around 2%. We had this little scare in December, but the fact is household spending is still going up, wages are still going up, housing is in short supply, there's plenty of capital in the markets, consumer confidence has kind of come down at the top because of the shutdown and trade and all these various things. Business confidence is still high, capital markets are wide open. The American economy is still chugging along. A lot of sentiment moves all over the place, but the fact is it's still chugging along. But I just want to also give a long-term perspective. This is the most prosperous economy the world has ever seen. And it will probably be true in the next 50 years, too, because people get too focused on the short run. And if you look at America, most Americans don't fully appreciate it. We have all the food, water, and energy we need. Okay, we have the Atlantic and Pacific, and we have wonderful neighbors in Mexico and Canada, and wonderful neighbors in Mexico and Canada. We have not had a war since 1848. I want to compare that respectfully with China, which people think has this untrammeled road to just get ahead. They don't have enough food, water, and energy. Okay, they don't have, their neighbors are Philippines, Japan, North Korea, South Korea, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Russia, Vietnam. It's a tough part of the world. Okay, and they've had battle skirmishes with 4 or 5 of those nations since World War II. They also don't have our universities. They don't have our democracy. They don't have a rule of law. They don't, huge amount of corruption in their state-owned enterprise, inefficiencies. We have it pretty good. And my biggest frustration is the things that we're not doing to make it better for average Americans. And most of the things the way we're not doing better, I'm just going to list them real quick, is we're doing it to ourselves. It's not technology. It's not immigration. Okay, it's none of that. It's we put a man on the moon in 8 years. President Kennedy says man on the moon. 8 years later, we have a man on the moon. Now most of you, the governors here, you want to build a bridge, 10 to 12 years to get the permits to build a bridge. Okay, the highway bill took 29 pages, and 9 years later, the first one, the Eisenhower one, there are 21,000 highway miles built. Now it's almost impossible. I know some of you are doing a great job at it, but with the pitfalls we put in front of you, our inner city school, my wife is here, is working in the South Bronx and this, our schools are filling inner city school kids. Okay, half of them don't graduate. It's a national emergency. You talk about loss of opportunity, you know, and among those kids that might be governors, people who could have been governors, mayors, presidents, Albert Einsteins, because we fail these kids. And a lot of these kids we do actually get through high school are not able to have a job because they're not job ready. And our regulation system, I'm not talking about banks, forget banks, okay, anyone who has to deal with it, and you all have to deal with it, it can be crippling. George McGovern became a small businessman after he was governor, who ran for president, most liberal guy who ever ran. And he wrote an op-ed, get it, so it was in the Wall Street Journal like 1989, about he didn't realize how all these things cripple small businesses. So small business formation is lower than it's ever been in a major American recovery. Okay, it's corruption, by the way. It's local. It's licenses to become a barber. It's people slowing things down. And I also think a lot of it's our own selfishness. You know, businesses are very selfish. I know that they spoke about the SALT tax here recently. You know, I'm with a lot of real estate people, and they're complaining about the SALT tax. 80% of the benefit of state and local taxes goes to 5 states and people making over $500,000 a year. So the real estate people complain to me about the one thing, because it hurts real estate values a little bit. They got to keep carried interest. They got to keep interest deductibility. They got to keep capital gains transfers tax-free. And they lost one little thing to complain about it. And, you know, and this is all of us, you know, governments, people, we just don't get our own way and do what's right for the United States of America. We spend far too much time being parochial. And I can blame businesses, I can blame politicians, et cetera. We're holding ourselves back. And we fix some of these things, which by the way, some of you have done. I mean, so you're doing it. You're building infrastructure and creating schools, and this economy will boom and help a lot more people.
Yeah.
Thank you. Governor?
So there's a lot there to respond to, but one of the issues that we deal with as governors all the time is how do we make sure that the people who live in our state have the skills that are required to get a good job?
Yeah.
And I know that's something you've thought a lot about. Every business executive does think about it. We've worked together on the New Skills for Youth program. We've used a lot of that to start apprenticeship programs and internship programs. But as you think about your workforce needs, now 10 years, 20 years in a changing economy, you know, how do you think about it? How do you think about meeting that challenge for your company and also, you know, more broadly?
Yeah. So I think about our own company, it's actually rather easy. We can hire the best schools, we can pay what we need to pay. We spend $250 million a year directly training, and probably another $500 million a year indirectly trained. Just you work with the company, always being trained in new technology, new devices, people always being promoted from a teller to a branch manager, and that's just kind of training. The bigger issue to me is if you go around the world, okay, 30% of our students go to college, 70% don't. That's true fundamentally in Switzerland and Germany. The unemployment rate in Switzerland and Germany for kids 17 to 24 is like 3%. They start apprenticeships. You're in 10th grade or something like that, 1 day at work, paid. 2 days the next year, 3 days the next year. The business, so locally you need X and you need Y and we need Z. It's got to be done locally with mayors and cities about what do you need. We have to go help train the people. My wife set up a program to train tellers. Okay, we train tellers in community colleges. And when they get out, they have jobs, $35,000 a year with medical. Okay, these are good jobs, they're starter jobs and stuff like that. So we actually know it works. France, the unemployment rate with youth is 20%. So what we're trying to do, and we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars around the world looking at this, is to just disseminate the best ideas that you already do. Because it really does work, but it's got to be local. This is not a huge federal program. This is your colleges, your community colleges, your businesses working with you, and the business should say, I'm going to hire those 100 kids, I'm going to help train them, you got to certify them. So like a community college of New York, you know, if you can't get kids with college, and they can go to college afterwards. Having a job doesn't mean you can't go to college later, and we know it works. In New York City, there's a school called the Aviation High School. Kids travel 2 or 3 hours to go there. The parents want them to go there. Most of the kids are minority from poor neighborhoods. They graduate, get a high school education, $60,000 a year, maintain small aircraft. Almost all of them. That's all we got. And we know what to do. We just don't seem to get out of our own underwear sometimes.
Well said.
There you have it. We don't get out of our own underwear. So you have many of the nation's governors here with us this morning. What would you say are the 3 public policy changes that you'd advocate for or recommend to us to help us grow the economy and better prepare our states for the future.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that governors and mayors, my experience is once they get that job, it's no longer about Democrat or Republican, which I personally don't give a damn about, okay? It's about jobs, schools, roads, hospitals, ambulance times, lights being turned on. It's about helping Americans, all of them. And I think business has to play a much more ambitious part in this. I don't think it's going to be done just by government. You need government, civic society, people working together. But the most important ones, we got it, 40% of Americans make $15 an hour or less. Okay, 15% make minimum wage. A lot.
Stop funding climate change. Jason is the worst. Jamie Dimon.
Just keep going.
Yeah, so one of the things that we got to get more income to these kids. A lot of Americans can't afford a $400 or $500 event. You know, if they have a healthcare event, they can't afford it. They don't have a rainy day fund. So we have to get income of those things. I would like expand the earned income tax credit, et cetera.
So, you know, one of the questions, Jamie, to this point, and we were talking a little bit about that earlier, is I think you've done a terrific job as a leader suggesting that business has a role to play.
Yeah.
You know, how do we, because we all try to partner with business to say, come to the table, help us solve these problems, invest in job training, you know.
And a lot of you do. You know, it's more the federal government, which is just crippling. I mean, and you look at what we can't get done. And so I'm the chairman of the Business Roundtable. It's 200 larger companies. It actually does policy and advocacy around tax, trade, immigration, work skills, diversity, innovation, corporate governance to get people thinking a little bit more long term. And we try to be non-parochial. And a lot of businesses get involved, but you know, some don't. And I think some businesses are short-term focused. Some have to be. I mean, you know, if you can afford to do these things, that's great. My #1 job, I have to make JP Morgan healthy and vibrant for my communities, my employees, the people we finance and stuff like that. If I don't do a good job at JP Morgan, I fail. But in the meantime, and I think I see Peter Scheer there, you know, some of the people at JP Morgan, we've done these work skills programs. We do them in cities. Mayor Duggan of Detroit came up with this idea about, you know, I can't fund my small minority businesses can't get the same kind of funding that white businesses get because they don't have the same mortgage value, house values, or family to fall back on. And we formed this Entrepreneur Color Fund. And we started small in Detroit, and now we tripled the one in Detroit. We're doing it in New Orleans, San Francisco, South Bronx. So these programs work. I think businesses have to do it. I think, you know, anyone in government, you know, business, government, and civic society working together works. You see it in your state. You see what you guys have both done is exceptional. And, you know, at the local level, it works better than at the federal level. I don't know how to get the federal level working right. We are between gerrymandering, politics, what we're doing to ourselves is a disgrace. I've already mentioned the wide variety of areas that, you know, education, infrastructure, regulation, you name it. You know, companies want to do a good job. Most companies want to participate, and sometimes they don't know. They don't know how they can help you, so you should be unabashed by asking. But I've also found that when we work together, it works. When we don't work together, even JP Morgan does not want to get involved. I mean, I think we saw happen, you know, businesses, 160 million people work in America, 140 million work for business. And the thought that somebody can have a great society without fostering good business is not a good idea. And some cities and states, they treat business so badly that they're going to lose. People will leave, and it's not because they're not virtuous or moral. They just can't afford it.
So, you know, small business and entrepreneurship, it provides a critical path to economic mobility. And yet evidence would suggest that it's becoming more and more difficult to start and maintain a small business. So what are the biggest headwinds facing entrepreneurs today and small business owners? And what do you think they need to succeed? And in particular, you know, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of the work that you've done on inclusive entrepreneurship and including, we talked a little bit earlier about your Entrepreneurs of Color Fund, which I know is expanding in our region in the DC, Maryland market, which we appreciate very much.
Yeah. So, you know, small business, 28 million businesses in America. The biggest 2,000 do maybe half all capital expenditures, so they're important. This country will not be worse off without Boeing. Okay, we need these very successful large companies. There are 20 million which are one person. Think of nail shops and pizza shops, and there's 8 million of all various sizes. I think when we survey a lot of small business people, I urge all of you, take 10 small business people to lunch and ask them the question. And what they will tell you is the onerous, excessive licensing regulations at the federal, state, and local level. So you want to be a barber in New York City, I think it takes 3 licenses. There are 3 different jurisdictions, you have to pay, and you have to be trained. And this training is 6 months. So, even if there's open jobs, people can't afford to move to take the job because it takes too long to get the train, even though we're doing it in another state. So it is a form of sinecure. I mean, so I know a lot of the governors here, and I know mayors do, look at all the rules and regulations, just start killing the ones which are stifling bureaucracy that are not protecting people. Obviously, we got to protect people, and companies should be held, held to be liable if they do bad, wrong things or pay for their mistakes. But it's mostly that. It is and we've heard entrepreneurship. I'd add the litigation system, okay, and the healthcare system. Our healthcare system costs 18.5% of GDP. We have among the best ever. Pharma, medical, you name it, hospitals, people get in right away, emergency rooms. But we fail on wellness. We have too much obesity. We don't, drugs are overused and underused. End of life is 15%. It should be half of that. Our medical costs are twice the average developed nation. And that is, Warren Buffett calls a tapeworm of American business. It will be a tapeworm. And for lower paid individuals, they can't afford a deductible and they have a problem. So we're like JP Morgan, we actually reduced deductibles on lower paid employees, just lower paid employees, such that if they do their wellness program, there's no deductible. So they don't get this crippling, $1,000 bill or something like that in a month. So small businesses, we got to make it easier for them to get medical insurance for their people and reduce the burden. It's not, by the way, it's a little bit, they say, access to capital, but that's very rarely the case. I do think for some community banks who are under a lot of pressure from regulators, they have cut back on small business lending because of it. So I do think we can open that spigot a little bit to make it easier. And then special programs. The Entrepreneur Color Fund, it's not traditional bank financing. We go an extra mile and take a little extra risk. And we may not get the same returns, but it works. And we're doing it for entrepreneurs of color. We're doing it for women entrepreneurs. We're going to seek out now, and we're doing it in Baltimore, and we're doing it in Rhode Island and Providence. We're seeking out how can we do something different we've never done before. And maybe we're earning a sub-market return, but we're helping society. And I think, again, businesses should be trying to do that because this won't age well if we don't fix some of these issues.
Thank you, Governor. Before we turn it over to them.
I think we ought to turn it. We have a handful of governors here.
We want to open it up to our fellow governors to have anybody got some comments or questions or input? Don't be shy. Governor Herbert?
I'm never shy.
I didn't think so.
Good to see you again.
Good to see you, Jamie. And Spence Eccles says hi.
Great.
So here's the question. It's kind of an accusation that we hear a lot. The economy is doing well. I think most of the states feel like the economy's recovered and we're doing better. We certainly feel that way in Utah. But the accusation I hear all the time is the rich are getting richer. The poor are staying poor. Middle class is shrinking and has a disproportionate amount of the tax burden. I'd like your observation.
Yeah. So whenever I hear people say something, I try to look at where they're right. So even some of these very left social democrats, et cetera, some of that's actually right. Lower paid folks do not earn a living wage anymore. And it used to be that if you were unskilled, you can get a job in a factory or something or construction and eventually earn a living wage. That may not be true anymore. That's why I would expand the earned income tax credit. Some middle class wages are going up a little bit, not quite we've seen. Partially because of the anemic growth. So if I was a politician, I'd want a growth agenda because nothing pays for anything like growth. Growth pays for roads, it pays for education, it pays for better social outcomes, et cetera. But I think we have to acknowledge that the lower paid aren't getting enough money to live in a living wage. And it's bad for society. We have a better outcomes in society if people have a job. And the other thing is the left side denigrates certain jobs. They denigrate the burger flipper job. They denigrate the starting job. And jobs are dignity. Most people like working. If you go to the average fast food place, that may have been a starter job. That was the first rung on the ladder for that person. Most of the people who run these restaurants now started that way. They're proud of themselves. And we've got to give dignity back to work. And of course, if we have more people working, you'll have less crime, less corruption, less opioid, more household formation. So I think we have to acknowledge it. And the issue is getting growth, sharing the wealth a little bit better. I think the rich have made a lot of money. So if I was a Democrat, I think the Democrats should acknowledge a lot of things the government did not work. Okay, they have failed, and we spent trillions of dollars on it. And that the American public, including Democrats, want to know that if you take more money, whether it's at the state level or the federal level, what are you going to do with it, as opposed to just goes to your friends and family. And so there's this notion that somehow, that when money goes to Washington, it's a great sucking sound, it's not being properly used. And so Democrats should acknowledge that. Republicans have to acknowledge we need proper safety nets for the poor, the sick, the old. We're failing to educate our kids, and then come together and go to programs that actually work. And and if you're going to tax more, which I think we're going to end up doing as a nation, I think it's unavoidable, let's attack some of the problems, and let's make sure that we have things that work, as opposed to just more taxation, more stifling bureaucracy, more finger pointing, and things like that.
But sticking with that point for a minute, I think we all agree work provides dignity more than just a paycheck. But the reality is the changes in our economy are faster than we've ever seen. In the last recession, most of the jobs lost, and people who lost their jobs, those jobs just required a high school degree. And since that time, almost all the jobs created, and I'm sure this is true at your company, in order to get a decent job, you need to have something more than a high school degree. Maybe not a four-year degree, maybe not four-year college, but a credential, something. So, but yet the majority of Americans don't have that. So what do we say to people who just have that high school degree, who want a good paying job, who can't feed their family on $12 an hour? How do we deal with that?
Yeah, so I mean, it's true. And so first of all, technology is the best thing that ever happened to mankind. The notion that technology is a bad thing is a bad idea. It's why we live longer. It's why we have this wealthy, prosperous nation of ours. It's why the health is. It's why everything is better. And if you don't believe me, go back 100 years. My grandparents were Greek immigrants. They came here with the shirt in their back and dirt. They didn't inherit any wealth. And if you got to one, you might live to 50. Okay, so everything is much better, and we should acknowledge that. But it is true that we are leaving behind segments of society don't have the education. And my wife was working, now she's got, I think, 100 interns and kids going to the various schools, internships where they're going to get well-paying jobs. And companies do it. We train people all the time at the start of a job. You're doing it at the University of Rhode Island, University of Maryland, and again, it's going to have to be local. And then my other view is that companies, so people worry about this. So we have 8 million car and truck, taxi and truck drivers in America. If somehow AI is able to get self-driving, boom, people making $65,000 a year out of work. That's not going to work really well. And therefore, we have to have a retraining, relocation, income assistance if it happened too fast. Remember, this has been happening our whole lives, but it's possible to be too fast. So at JP Morgan, for example, we're looking today at, we know that AI will reduce the people in call centers and operating centers. So we are going to be really prepared so that use attrition, let it come down a little bit, retrain them to do other jobs. There are tons of other jobs we need to be done, and even retrain them to get jobs at other companies. So we know that in Phoenix, or in this city they want coding, in this city they need phlebotics, in this city they need welding, in this city they need. We're going to pay our people to go get trained to get another job, and an equal paying job. It's not going to work if you have a family making $65,000 a year and there's an available job at $25,000. That's just not going to work. So again, I think all of these things go back to training, skills, apprenticeships, internships, lifelong education that would work for Americans.
Yeah.
Any of the others want to weigh in on that particularly, on workforce, job training, or some other topic? Governor Stitt.
Yeah. Well, first off, I'm so sorry. I can't speak for all the governors, but sorry about that outburst here. That was uncalled for. We appreciate you coming and sharing your thoughts with us.
Thank you.
So regarding the getting capital, so as far as encouraging capital getting to our small businesses, our minority businesses, what you did a very good job of explaining how our economy is moving with the small entrepreneurs. Is there anything we can do from a state banking regulatory environment or a federal regulatory environment to ease the burden on large banks and our community banks, whether it's Tier 1 capital ratios, or where do you think the balance is there, protecting the taxpayers and the insurance versus encouraging access to capital in our small businesses?
Yeah, so one of the things that we should mention about America's strengths, and if you get to go around the world, you see these kind of things. We have the best, widest, deepest, most transparent financial markets ever, better than anybody. And it's part of the economic strength. It's kind of flywheel of this thing. I'm not talking about big banks. I'm talking about big ones, small ones. And we bank, certain companies in 20 countries. We move $6 trillion a day. But part of that mosaic is venture capital, private equity, small business, small banks. And it is true, and I'm very sympathetic that a lot of the small banks, when I meet with them all the time, we're the largest banks of small banks, they would tell you it's the cost of regulation. They have more compliance officers than loan officers. It's the fear of pissing off the local examiner. So it's not even Dodd-Frank. It's just they're told, we don't want any more of these types of loans or something like that. It's the litigation cost if you're wrong. So a lot of banks, if you survey, they stay away from anything which might create a litigation cost because it's so capricious and arbitrary. And, and I think it's probably the Achilles heel of America, too. It's ruining self-responsibility, and the punishment doesn't fit the crime, et cetera. And then local regulations. And again, we should applaud entrepreneurs. We should applaud small business people. We should applaud job creators. And so one thing I think is at JP Morgan, we have 5,000 branches, and we're going to put these big screens in all these branches. To have people like General Ray Ordiano or some great small business person or a governor talk to, if we can get 50 small business people in every branch, that's 25,000 people. And to talk about what works and what doesn't work. The other thing, by the way, is when we partner with a lot of people. So we're doing this great work in Detroit, but we have people on the ground at a not-for-profit who's working with the entrepreneur about what they need to learn to get more traditional bank financing. Budgets, leases, how you sign a deal with the federal government, hiring people, where do you place the branch? Where do you place their next business to maximize traffic? How do you do various things? So there are a lot of things to do to foster entrepreneurship at a local level and then change some of these regulations and get a little bit easier in these community banks.
Governor Carney?
So in your response to Governor Hogan's question at the outset, you mentioned that we're failing inner city kids, and you referenced your wife's great work in New York City. Have you learned anything I think it's a problem in every small town, city, and large city across the country. Have you learned anything through your work there that you can help us with respect to our efforts for educating inner city kids?
Yeah, so we should send you some information, but what we know already is that internships, apprenticeships work. The businesses have to have it certified. It's got to count for college credit or high school credit. And to the extent, I don't believe in unpaid internships. I think if you can afford it, it's unfair to have kids work for free. I think just something bothers me about that. It's got to be at the local level. And you got to get help from the community college. So in one of these towns, the community college, they like the idea, but they won't certify the position. So if you go to Germany or Switzerland, these kids get, what they do in that thing about machine tooling, coding, they get college credit for it. So it opens up all these horizons for them. And so it really is at the local level, working with the schools, high schools, community colleges. We have to convert high schools back to not just learning about life, but leaving with a livelihood. And we used to be very good at that. Remember, we had these vocational schools and, all over the country, and they might teach welding or construction or electrical, not engineering, but electrical work, how does that be wired? There's 7 million jobs open in America today. Most of them are well-paying, and they're not being filled. And these things we got to get cracking at that because it would do a great thing to do. And so,
Governor Bullock?
Jamie, it's heartening as you talk about what JP Morgan's doing as relates to AI and changes and actually making sure that workers are retrained even if they're not at your own company. Not enough companies necessarily are looking at sort of that long-term social contract. How do we, either at the state or federal level, incentivize businesses to be investing in worker training, and even more so than they're investing in business equipment or robots? And also, how do we de-incentivize the growth of independent contractors?
Yeah, that's a good question. So one of the things, I do think there's a somewhat legitimate issue about long-term thinking. So for JP Morgan, we don't do any, I've never worried about quarterly profits, ever, ever, ever. I worry about people, systems, ops, technology, products, services, costs. Of course, we make a huge amount of mistakes, but we build for the long term, and I do think it's a little bit overly focused. We've urged companies, and I think the BRT recommended this, don't forecast quarterly earnings. Have quarterly numbers, be transparent, but earnings is kind of a tip of an iceberg. You know, prices are changing, the weather changes, it's almost impossible to forecast, and companies get their back up against the wall and disappoint people. I think part of that is also, again, class action suits and litigation. People are so cautious and stuff, but I think businesses want to do the right thing for the long run. I think businesses attract the shareholders they deserve, by the way. So I think if you're overreacting to short term, you know, Warren Buffett talks about the earnings thing as being a very important thing. He never worries about it, but that company should focus. And of course, you have shareholders now, including your pension plans and stuff like that. So here's another one. Here's an inconsistency, an hypocrisy in America. A lot of state-owned pension plans will come up to me, and they want to know exactly what we're doing for the long run, for my employees, for this community. And we tell them. And they want to know about compensation, which I think is all legitimate. They then turn around and invest in hedge funds and things like that get paid 20% of the profits of that year. So very often, they're incenting exactly the behavior they say they don't want themselves. So, you know, if shareholders are doing that, then companies are going to react. And so in America, this is a major thing. We've gone from 8,000 public companies to 4,000 public companies. We are driving them private because of all these issues I mentioned, regulations, litigation, short-term incentives. It makes it hard for companies to think long-term. So we just got to bring back the notion of thinking long-term, explain it. You know, Larry Fink at BlackRock wrote a thing about that we should describe to you what we're doing. We're opening, now we've gotten permission to, 400 new branches. That's 4,000 people directly. That's going to be another 8,000 people indirectly. When we go into Anacostia, Baltimore, Prince George's County, Ward 7, Ward 8 over here, we go in with all of J.P. Morgan. We open a branch, Entrepreneur of Color, philanthropy, education for people who need financial education, charity. We do the whole thing. And so, like the big shit about Amazon, it wasn't just the 25,000 jobs Amazon has to do. It's probably going to be 100,000 jobs supporting it. And they would have gone from low-skilled to high-skilled, to consultants and lawyers, to restaurants and barbers and construction workers, and that's the shame. That's what they lost. The whole ecosystem that creates jobs and furthers interest, and cities and states that act that way, they will be long-term losers. I was in New York City in 1974, and we had our financial crisis and crime and all these terrible things. 10 Fortune 50 companies left the city in a 5-year period. Exxon, which went to Dallas, JCPenney went to Texas, American Airlines left. It was amazing. Companies were just leaving. And so, cities and states can foster an attractive environment and then help you guys do the other parts. I think business is not to blame for all these bad outcomes. I think business could do more to help fix the bad outcomes.
What about the de-incentivizing or discouraging independent contractors?
I think that's a valid point, okay? So our whole Detroit effort started when Lee Saunders, who runs AFSCME, and I was talking to him about a corporate governance issue with J.P. Morgan. And he said, I don't care about that. What I care about is in Detroit, which hadn't gone bankrupt yet, my workers are going to retire, and they're going to lose their pension plans. And he said the average pension plan for someone who's worked for 35 years is $20,000, and they don't get Social Security. I didn't know that. I said, that's terrible. We're a huge bank in Detroit. I said, I'm going to help you. So he and I have become friends, and we try to help get the city through, which is why we made this huge effort in Detroit. It's one of our hometowns where we came from. But they also, the SEIU came to see me at one point and complained that we'd outsource certain janitorial jobs and guards. And we did. And I listened to Andy Stern, and people said, don't meet with him. I'll meet anybody. I'm not afraid to talk to anybody about anything. And he said, you did it, and the guard is the same guard who shows up. They get the same pay. You pay the independent firm, $2,000 or $3,000 or $4,000. The reason it's profitable for them and you is they took away their medical. And I took back all those guards, all of them. J.P. Morgan does not need to make its profit off the backs of the medical stuff for our guards. Now, some companies, by the way, are not in that position. They can't afford medical. So I'm very sympathetic. I tell all these people who do all the do-gooders, yeah, well, go run U.S. Steel during the tough times. It's much tougher. And that, they're your survival. And when you're trying to fight for survival, it's different. But in the meantime, companies can try to be really good corporate citizens. Train their own people. Don't outsource something where the only way you're going to save money is because you don't give them medical. Treat people with respect. J.P. Morgan ourselves, we subsidize 90% of people who make under $60,000 medical. And then we make it freer with health accounts, et cetera. I went out and I found out one day that that our 401k, we gave these huge matches, and all the money is going to our wealthy paid people. So I limited the match to the higher paid people. I asked the question one day, why don't people put money in? We give them free money. We match it 2 to 1 or 3 to 1. 40,000 people weren't putting money in. And I did an analysis. Why? They were all people making under $40,000 a year. They needed the money. It wasn't that they were dumb. And so we started that we automatically gave them $750 in their account. You make under $60,000 a year, we open a 401k for $750 for you. And then if you put more money in, we match it too. To try to help take care of the lower paid folks who were critical to the success of JP Morgan. And so there are things that people can do, and some companies do, and jawboning, sharing best ideas, those are the best ideas I can have.
So you mentioned all those companies leaving New York, and you mentioned Amazon, which we're working hard to try to steal over to Maryland. The question is, what do we have to do to get JP Morgan?
Well, you did a good thing right from the start because you elected Larry Hogan. Because when you're a company, well, of course you want to go to places where you're welcome. They listen to you. You have an open conversation and make it better. And we have a great relationship with most of the states here. Texas jobs are going like this. Delaware, Utah, you name it. I mean, I think a lot of here. So it literally is to be a welcoming place and consistent. It's consistent because we have to deal with around the world. If governments are hugely inconsistent, you kind of tend to stay away. And so think of parts of Europe.
Right. We talked a little bit about this backstage, and I think you and I both feel passionately about it. I think a lot of our audience would like to hear about this. The American public today is deeply divided along political lines, and you have to navigate, both through the court of public opinion. You have 250,000 employees, I think, in a private enterprise. I mean, how do you approach collaboration and cooperation with the government in such a polarized time?
Yeah, so this may surprise you a little bit, but obviously, family is the most important thing to me. My wife and my children. Now, I have 3 daughters and 4 granddaughters. I don't know how that happened, but the next most important thing is the United States of America. It is still the shining city on the hill. And if you don't believe me, you spend a couple weeks on the road with me in other parts of the world. It's not even close. So I'm a huge patriot that way, and I think that is what we need to do: is focus on what is good for the United States and not always what's parochial. And but I forgot your specific question.
Talking about the polarization, you talked about some of the things you thought were the problem.
I try, well, it's more federal government than most, and I always try to listen to both sides and try to understand where they may be right. So when I hear about lower paid, they're right. When I hear about we're not doing jobs, they're right. When I hear about inner city schools, they're right. But slogans are not policy. We have to get much smarter about policy that gets done, and governors learn that right away. You can get elected saying anything you want about the rich, the poor, taxes, but if you don't get the roads fixed and you don't get the hospitals working, and you don't get kids jobs, and you'll fail as a governor or a mayor. And so I try to listen. Like I said, I've met with the union leaders. I'm responsive when they complain about something like that. On the other hand, and we write extensively about public policy. So you see JP Morgan Chase, we educate the world about economy. We go to Mexico and Argentina and about how you develop capital markets, how do you develop entrepreneurship, how do you get your universities. So we want to foster a very healthy economic environment, and it is part of my job. I have never been conflicted, ever. I don't buy this thing about that companies only care about shareholder value. That's just not true. Okay, I care most of the CEOs I know would agree with me, is that you got to do a great job for employees to do a good job for customers. If I don't serve my customers right, they don't come back. And right is better, faster, quicker, cheaper, and more next year than this year. And my communities, if we're not good in communities, you don't want us there. And I don't look at JP Morgan. We operate in like 2,000 little cities and little cities around the world, but I treat it exactly the same as if you owned the corner bakery store. That corner bakery store is a community citizen. They hire a kid in the summer. They get the ice off the front so someone doesn't break their leg. They participate in the local Little League or a church or a mosque or a synagogue or something like that because that's our community. That's how you teach people. And I think just because you're big doesn't mean you should stop doing that. So I've never been conflicted between the two. But I remind people, if I don't build a healthy, vibrant company, then it's just all talk. I have to have a healthy, vibrant company first, and then I can do all these other good things. Our people love it, by the way. So all the things we talk about we're doing, skills around the world, entrepreneur of color funds, we're doing really special things to advance black leaders inside our company. Our people love it. They just feel, my God, we're not only doing a good job for our customers, but doing it for our communities. They get to do volunteer hours, and so I think it lifts up everybody.
No doubt. Governor Sisolak.
Jamie, let me ask you a question. What do you think could be done better to enhance financial literacy in our schools? I mean, we've lost a generation. They don't understand the cost of credit, budgeting process, so forth and so on, and then we throw them in the world without any foundation.
So I think, I remember when I was a young CEO at Bank One, they asked me to go talk to kids in like 3rd or 4th grade, and I read them a little book, and I said, this isn't going to work. You know, like they don't understand what I'm talking about. I certainly don't understand where they're coming from. You got to teach it in schools. So if I were all of you, I would take in every high school, maybe start earlier, basic financial education. What is a rainy day fund? When do you need life insurance? What is a bank account? How can you avoid payday lenders? And I do another thing, nutrition and health. Like walk a couple miles a day. Like just, because those two things will be critical for the future of society. We do it extensively, but you can't like rely on just, I think it needs to be done in churches, schools. We actually, but now on our app, so if you are a Chase client, we give you, you can buy and sell stock for free, and we give you eat for free tools that you can use to look at retirements and things like that. But you know what's become really popular? You get for free your FICO score, your credit score. So you open it up, you look at your credit score, and we're starting to educate how can you improve it. You can improve it by having $400 a day rainy fund. You can improve it by paying this next bill coming up on time. 10 million people signed up for it like that, and we haven't marketed it. So people are dying to have it. And I've asked the people who run our retail system, when we go to Ward 7, Ward 8, and Anacostia, try something different. You know, have wine and cheese for single mothers who can bring their kids in and then educate them about a rainy day fund. Just a rainy day fund. You know, just how you start investment. What's a 401k? And so I think we have to do it because we've done a bad job. And we're going to try everything. We're going to test everything. But I really think it should start in the schools.
You made a comment earlier, and we all know this, that there are millions of open jobs, many people who want jobs, and they're not getting matched up. Some of it I find is that companies are still searching for people that have the 4-year college degree when they don't actually need the 4-year college degree to do that job. So how do we deal with that?
Totally true. Again, I always listen. When people say that, something like that to me, I don't know it, I go study it. And I did. It's true. Companies became lazy. So they said college degree required. It was just an easy scale. It's just an easy screen.
The screen.
And so think of tellers, it's not required. And so we went back at JP Morgan and took the college degree required off of tens of thousands of jobs.
Good for you.
It's not required. Worse than that, a lot of college kids, if they go become a teller, do you think they want to be a teller? Probably not. So there's turnover, attrition. But I'll make you bet the kids that graduate high school or community college and they get that $35,000 a year job with medical, pension, 401k, you know, they are thrilled and they move up the ladder. You know, like the guy, my wife was in the room and a guy stood up, a woman stood up with all the jewelry and stuff and said, those are just starter jobs. They're dead-end jobs. And he stood up, he's an attractive black man. He said, ma'am, I started as a teller at JP Morgan Chase. I'm now a managing director, and I'm responsible for hiring 40,000 people a year. I am so proud of what I've accomplished and what this company's done for me. And so it's things like that we got to tell the story.
Yeah,
tell the story. And
last question.
But the BRT's looking at that too, by the way.
It's a big issue.
To take it out where it's not necessary. And also, we went to the FDIC, Yelena McWilliams, Yelena, and we told her we can't hire felons who didn't do serious crimes, but we can't hire felons in a lot of jobs in our industry by regulatory statute effectively. She changed it.
Great.
We're hiring felons now. In fact, Peter Scheer, who I know we both love, was in Detroit yesterday. And there was a picture of him with the fellows now working for us who say thank you. Give people a chance. If you paid your time in society, have a second chance. And so there are all these things we can do.
Good for you. Good for you.
Governor Little.
Housing affordability, there's lots of state programs and federal programs. Governor Bullock has a first-time homeowner savings account where you can save money tax-free now. Obviously, if you're in a state without income tax, it's not helpful. If the federal government would do it, it would be more helpful. What do you think the solution is to the housing affordability issue?
Yeah, so one of our economists did a study which showed that affordable housing is least affordable and least available in the places that have the most land use restrictions. Okay, so our regulations have made it very hard to build affordable housing. We do $1 billion a year affordable housing, equity, debt, and stuff like that. The other thing is, and I like these ideas, we actually did a study and it showed that if you had a rainy day fund, the chance of a mortgage default is like 20% if you don't, if you have the exact same credit stuff. So teaching people education is important. But we messed up the mortgage business. So after the crisis, we massively overreacted. There are 3,000 federal, state, and local origination and servicing requirements. Like we send you a bill, 3,000. The cost of that, we think, has added 30 basis points to mortgages. Because of that, mortgages are less available, less affordable, and more expensive. And then litigation, on top of that, most banks have gotten out of FHA lending because of the litigation behind it. But the people being hurt, and we think it's $1 trillion of net new mortgages, are self-employed, immigrant, prior default, younger, and poor. And these are not subprime. These are just not giving a chance to those people because those things. So fix the mortgage market, look at your local zoning rules, education. Those, we will get more people living in homes.
Yeah. So we are just about out of time. I want to thank you so much for joining us. This has been a fantastic panel, and I appreciate the way you've been so open with us and covering a range of topics. I will again thank you for your partnership on the New Skills for Youth program. It's been fantastic. Those governors who don't know about it, I'd encourage you to learn about it. We've started internships, apprenticeships, career and technical education. I can't thank you enough for your partnership. But with that, I'd like to give you, a couple of minutes to offer any closing remarks.
Yeah. So the only closing remarks is we can fix all this. Okay, I don't know exactly how to fix the federal system, but we can fix all this if we roll up our sleeves, we get in the room, we listen to each other, we analyze it, we come up with really good policy, and then you all, you're politicians, you have to convert that policy into educating and moving the population with you. It doesn't work when they don't. So that's obviously not my expertise, but that's the kind of stuff works. And the last thought, I'll just leave it. I appreciate the fact that, I know a lot of the governors in this room, those of you who've done a great job for your communities and mayors. It's great you're doing this because I hope when you get together privately, you kind of shed the Democrat-Republican thing, just worry about what works for America because we can make it a better country for everybody.
Hear, hear. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good job.
Over 500,000 children are currently in foster care. The county puts these on because they can match a lot of kids and parents quickly.
Look at the big kids.
Everybody's avoiding them. I'm gonna go and say hi.
But they're teenagers, okay? They use drugs and they watch people playing video games on YouTube. We're not equipped for any of that.
Hi! Just FYI, we can all hear you. It's okay. Go mingle with the kitties and don't give it another thought. Bye-bye.
She was cool.
Lizzie comes with 2 younger siblings.
3 kids? Too much.
Oh
my God.
They're adorable.
Why would you show us that? That's wrong.
Here we are.
Make yourself at home because you're at home.
Do you like the Clippers?
Oh, I'm more of a Lakers fan. Oh, no!
You hit me because I like the Clippers.
I think the Clippers are awesome. They were smart for trading Blake Griffin, their best player. All right, let me fix it, okay?
Thanks, Daddy.
I just got my first daddy. Oh, what the?
You suck! I want some of that. Hey, honey, can I help you with anything? No.
So I'm going to give you guys a couple seconds to sit down. Or not. My name's Charlie Baker. I'm the governor of Massachusetts, and I'm the vice chair of the Health and Human Services Committee. And I want to welcome you all to this conversation about child welfare, specifically rethinking child welfare. And the one thing I would say about that is we are constantly in the process of rethinking the way we deal with, support, and work with some of the most at-risk families and kids in our states. And we should be, because in many respects, these are some of our greatest challenges, and they represent, in many cases, the difference between opportunity and no opportunity for kids who, in many cases, through no fault of their own, end up in a particularly difficult spot. And I just want to make a couple of quick comments before I introduce the chair of the committee, Oregon Governor Kate Brown. The first is, I think one of the most important things we need to do to be successful in this space is recognize that our social workers who do much of the work day to day with families and with these kids need to be supported, and that means making the investments that are required to ensure that they're managing a reasonable number of cases, a reasonable number of families. The second is to make sure they have the clinical support that they need to support them as they make decisions with respect to the needs and the concerns and in many cases, psychological and medical issues that these kids and their families are often dealing with. And to the extent we can peel a lot of the administrative work away from the social workers so that they can really focus on doing social work and not on doing paperwork, we're going to dramatically improve their ability to do the work that they need to do. The second thing, and we've tried, all of those things, by the way, are things we've worked pretty successfully on in Massachusetts. The second thing we need to be better at is understanding and recognizing the role and the importance of placement and permanence when it comes to these kids. The more we can do to give them a sense of certainty about their future, the better off they will be. And whether that's working harder to develop kinship opportunities, where kids who have a mom or a dad or both who have problems end up staying with or being supported by and living with a family member, or ending up dealing with circumstance situations where we move kids in a reasonable time frame from some sort of state of uncertainty to a more certain state with respect to adoption or some other permanent relationship, the more likely they are to be successful. And then the third thing I want to mention is the work that we can all do to learn from each other with respect to those things that have ultimately determined the longitudinal success of these kids. Historically, states have not done a great job with respect to actually tracking, quote, what happens with respect to a lot of these kids and their families. The more we do to actually track this over time so that we can figure out which things really make a difference for them and for their families, the better off we're all going to be. This is a terrific panel. I think we're all going to learn a great deal from it. But as I said at the beginning, if you're not rethinking your child welfare policies and your child welfare programs every year, you ought to be, because this is the sort of thing where there's constant room for improvement and constant room for chance and opportunity for kids. I say all the time that talent is evenly distributed, opportunity is not. And the more that we can do to help make sure that these kids and their families have those opportunities, the better off they and we collectively will be. And with that, I want to turn it over to my tag team partner on this committee for the last several years. Oregon Governor Kate Brown and I have rotated between chairing and vice chairing the Health and Human Services Committee. She is now the chair, and I'm going to introduce her now. Kate?
Thank you, Governor Baker, for your extraordinary leadership on this issue and so many others. Good afternoon, everyone. I am honored to be here with you this afternoon and very excited about this panel. As governors, we have a truly unique opportunity to re-envision the way our child welfare system works in ways to better meet the needs of our children and families. And for me, this is a very personal issue. I first started practicing law in the juvenile justice arena, representing children and families in the foster care system. I then continued my work in this arena as a legislator, and now I have this opportunity as governor. And in my state, we have 1.5 times the national average, the number of children in our foster care system. So we're tackling those issues within our child welfare system. But as governor, I'm really focused on how we can address the root causes, the reason why we're seeing so many children come into the foster care system. So I am delighted to be introducing our panel that has been, that are experts in the area and that are really focused on reducing the number of children safely that are in our foster care system and hopefully better serve our children and families throughout the United States. So our moderator is Dr. Jeremy Cohenbahn. He's an author, advocate, and expert in child welfare and juvenile justice. He is the president and CEO of Children's Village, which cares for children through family support, community engagement, and short-term residential interventions. Sean Anders is a renowned writer and director who recently turned his personal experience with foster care and adoption into the Hollywood film Instant Family, starring Mark Wahlberg and Rose Byrne. Governor Bevin has made significant strides in Kentucky, streamlining and improving the child welfare system, with particular focus on improving adoption timelines and serving children and families impacted by the opioid crisis. And First Lady Edwards, she's focused on transforming the foster care system in Louisiana, particularly focusing on connecting foster parents with community supports and fostering cross-agency collaboration. I'd like to welcome our panelists to the stage. Please give them a round of applause.
Thank you, Governor. Okay. Thank you for this opportunity. First Lady Edwards, Governor Bevan, Sean, thank you for joining us. Before I ask you a few questions and we start talking about the work that we need to do together, let me set the stage as a practitioner. When it comes to helping children, the persistent theme in the United States has been that we often needlessly separate children from the one thing that they love and need the most, which is their parents, their siblings, and their family. In the United States, family separation has always been disproportionate. Poor families, and those families that society values the least, are at the greatest risk to losing their children. Few of us in this room would ever lose our children to the foster care system. In the early 1800s in New York City, where I work, the children we served, the ones that were separated, were initially Ashkenazi Jews and non-English speaking European immigrants. By the late 1800s and well into the first part of the 20th century, they were largely Irish Catholic. Today, and for the last 2 decades, most jurisdictions have seen an overrepresentation of Black and Native children in foster care. Black children enter the system faster, stay longer, and often exit with the worst outcomes. No question about that. In 2017, about 23,000 children aged out of foster care when they turned 18 or 21, depending on the state that they lived in. We believe another 25,000 aged out in 2018, and at least the same number will age out this year. Let me tell you something about these kids that are aging out. Many who age out spent at least 5 to 7 years in the foster care system prior to aging out. The lucky ones, we think about 50% of that group, actually returned to the very same families that we kept them away from, because that's all they had. The other 50% are struggling to survive. Some are couch surfing, as we spoke about earlier. Our girls are in very risky transient relationships, and they almost all remain dependent on government and charity. Let me also add that among this group, and for this group that ages out, we promised them a family, and we never gave them one. We never did. And many others never knew family. They actually came of age in institutions and group homes, including places like the Children's Village. 70 to 75% of the children that are separated from family are removed for neglect and not physical or sexual abuse. I know the general public often thinks that our kids are being removed for physical and sexual abuse. That's not true. Parent substance abuse is growing because of the opioid crisis. But the circumstances of neglect are most closely associated with poverty and abject poverty. That's it. So let me conclude my remarks by making 2 comments. Children do best in families. We're here to talk about that, the importance of family. In this great nation, we have more than enough families to care for all our children who are removed into foster care, including children with complex needs, no doubt about it. But one thing we must do, and I hope we'll get to talk about it a little bit more, we must begin treating those amazing foster families that step up as true partners. We do a horrible job at that. We can do more, and if anyone is interested, the CHAMPS campaign, fosteringchamps.org, talks about the things we can do together. With their help, and only with their help, can we transform the system. I will also add that group homes and institutions can play a role, and they're needed, but they can never be a place where kids grow up. The key to healing, as we all know, is the love and belonging of family. That's it. Or as my mother often reminds me, relationships heal. That's the magic balm. Relationships heal. Children should never belong to government or to a charity, even a charity like Children's Village. Government and charity can never be a substitute for the love of family. We are also on the cusp of some fundamental change in funding. It's called the Family First Prevention Services Act that President Trump signed in 2018. While not perfect, the Family First actually changes the perverse financial incentive that existed in federal funding. Because until Family First was signed, the only way you could draw down funding, the states could draw down funding, was to actually remove a child from a family. So unless you remove the child from the family, you were not eligible for that funding. With Family First, while not perfect, we think we can begin to build that preventive base, that early intervention that our communities so need, and maybe the number of children that are removed for neglect can begin to drop faster than we've begun to see. And when separation is needed, and there will be times, there are always times when we have to separate kids, Family First will allow us to build a family support network to keep them rather than an institution or a group home. That's the context for the conversation. Let me ask you a couple questions. First Lady Edwards, Governor Bevin, you put your reputations out on this, right? It's the least sexy of topics that you can pick. Child welfare, things are bound to go wrong. The media stories are never about the good things you do in child welfare. It's always about what went wrong. We admire your leadership. What are you most proud of, First Lady Edwards? What are you most proud of in Louisiana? Since you've stuck your neck out and said, I'm behind kids, and you often talk about our kids.
Right. Well, one of the things I'm most proud of is my husband, John Bel Edwards, who went in and said he would not tolerate cuts to DCFS. And that one statement, that there would be no cuts to DCFS, really gave the caseworkers and all those people involved in that program, gave them a little backbone. And that really started the trickle down, where more people were listening and more, gave them hope, really, because the caseworkers themselves, we all know that they don't get paid enough, and they do some amazing work and more hours than we can even imagine. But to give them work and really start equipping them with what they need through even more programming and things that help them. But you know, that and the fact that we started our Louisiana Fosters website. We had 2 summits at the mansion to bring in people from all over the state to sit at the table and discuss what things we can do to change, and just starting that dialogue. And that's what I'm most proud of. So, yeah.
That's great. Governor Bevin?
Let me just say one thing to everybody that's in here. Thank you for being here, for the governors that are sitting here, for those of you that are here as well, because you have the option of walking out of the room and not paying attention to this. This isn't necessarily a sexy topic. You're right. There's no political constituency that's served by addressing this. Most of the people we're talking about, vast majority of the children themselves, are completely ineligible to vote. I would submit that there are a few less sexy things you could address, but we won't go there now. But the bottom line is this. This is something that has got to be addressed. We have in America 450 some odd thousand children in the foster care system. It's a little more than 1% of our population. And to your point, if we can't find within ourselves the ability to come alongside and be part of the solution, then we're not making a very valiant effort. And all the things we wrestle with, not the least of which is where we find funding for all these various programs, they come at the expense of not fixing this issue at the front end and not wrapping around. What you described in terms of early intervention is the wrapping around of a troubled situation, bringing the services that we always have, but are not always well applied. They often are applied at the end of the funnel of trouble instead of at the top end. And so I just am grateful to each and every one of you, and I want to draw your attention to one thing before I forget. There's at each one of the tables of the governors, and we have some more in the back of the room that will be given out, is a one-pager of just 10 things that every governor and anybody who cares about this issue in any state role should know. And they include things like how many kids are in your foster care system? Right. What is the average wait time for someone to be adopted? You know, how many kids are aging out of your foster care system every year? Just how many people are living with family in what's, you know, often referred to as kinship care or maybe something else? How many such things exist in your states? If you don't know these 10 basic things, you're really failing to appreciate both the cost and opportunity cost. And the one thing you mentioned, and I'll touch on real quick, and then we can move to the next topic. You mentioned the cost to society of these young people once they age out. The average young person who ages out of foster care at the age of 18 without having a permanent family will cost, it's been estimated, and I think it's probably conservative, more than $300,000 per person over the course of their life, utilizing services that if we gave them the opportunity to be the solution and not the problem, could have been reversed. 34% of those who age out at the age of 18 will have had an adverse interaction with the criminal justice system by the time they are 19, 19 years old. For women, and you alluded to it, it is almost a statistical given that their lives will be taken advantage of, that they will be trafficked, that they will be abused, that they will end up living in poverty, as will their children. We are failing at a rate and to a degree that we cannot afford literally, financially or otherwise, societally, emotionally, morally, to fail. We can't afford it. And this is a problem when it's 1% of our kids that we have the absolute capacity to resolve this. And at a fraction of the price of actually fixing it once it's broken at the bottom. The final tiny thing I'll mention that you alluded to, and we talked about wrapping around and helping families. One thing I would challenge, it's not necessarily disagreeing with you, but challenging the notion of, there are some instances where the family, the biological family, is not the best solution for the child. And the earlier and quicker and more definitively and permanently that is determined in the development of that child, the better for all concerned. And so this, again, is maybe something we could talk about a bit more.
We agree. We think there are times when that decision needs to be made early. It's not a perfect science, though. We've got to work really hard at getting this right. And in those occasions, we should also expand our search to extended family first before we go out. But you're right. There's plenty of room here for improvement, Governor. Thank you. Sean, the Governor and the First Lady both set us up a little bit to talk about aging out teens and teens in the system. I mean, you capture this story so well in your movie. You introduce such humor. Tell us about the teens. You've met some teens, right? You and your wife, you had some interactions in the system. You went on to be adopted parents of three siblings.
Yeah.
Right? Where are we failing with our teens, and why are we failing so often? Why is it that people are so afraid of our teenagers?
Well, that's the perfect question, and I'm obviously not an expert. I'm a filmmaker and an adoptive dad.
You're a great storyteller.
Thank you. I'm also the only person here wearing jeans, so that's...
And the rest of us are jealous. That's all good.
That lowers the bar for my qualifications right there. But no, the last thing that you said there, why are they afraid? And that's, I can't even stress enough how huge that is. When you talk about all of these, everything else that we're doing almost falls underneath that. People are afraid of kids in care. I was. My wife and I went to an adoption fair. You saw a little clip of a version of it that's in the movie. We did not want to go anywhere near the teenagers because we were scared, and we just thought we're barely ready to be parents, let alone be parents of a teenager. And like as it happens in the movie, we wound up meeting this 16-year-old girl who was, you could just tell there was just something kind of amazing about her. We met her brother and sister, and we, with a lot of fear and trepidation, we wrote them down on our sheet, and we were matched with them. But in our true story, that didn't come to fruition because those kids had been in care for about 4 years. They were very much holding out hope that their mom was still coming for them, and they decided to refuse because it was an adoptive placement, and they decided to refuse the placement. So then they called us a short time later and just said, by the way, there's these other 3 siblings, and those are my kids who I love dearly and who are the best thing that ever happened to me. But when it came time to make the movie, I really wanted to have the story of a teenager in the movie because I knew that, where the need was there. And so in order to tell that story honestly, we sat down with a lot of families and a lot of kids who are now grown who were adopted as teenagers. And many of them became part of our filmmaking process. And I guess the main message, and I don't want to take up too much time, but anything in your individual PR efforts where you can get away from grim statistics and all of these things that frighten people and just make people get feelings of pity and fear and trepidation when they think about these kids, any way that you can focus on story and let people tell their stories and let the kids tell their stories. Because when a kid comes out and tells who roots for a kid more, or who roots for any character more than a child who is overcoming adversity and goes on to do great things. So anyway, any chances you have to tell those stories and just make all of us less afraid of these kids, that'll go a long way.
Thank you. Let me switch this up a little bit. First Lady Edwards, when we were speaking in the green room, you spoke about your workforce. And that's not a question we had planned to get into, but are you comfortable talking a little bit about the workforce? We have people on the front lines making tough decisions, taking massive risks, sometimes losing their entire career when things go wrong, right? And we need our governors and our first ladies and our leaders to stand behind our workforce while demanding accountability. And you've done a pretty incredible job in your state in driving that message forward. Can you describe what you're doing and what you're seeing? And are there things that we should take away from this?
Well, I think when our governor put our Secretary of Department of Children and Family Services, Marquita Walters, in that position, that was a big move because she had been in the system and been working with it for so many decades. And so just she alone brought so much, to that office. And so in that regard, so just dealing with the caseworkers, and I mentioned it earlier, but giving them what they need, training that they need. We're really, so many of you heard of TBRI training them, but also, helping them train other people that are dealing straight, with a child, whether it's a teacher, a person in a classroom. The everyday teacher doesn't understand the foster child maybe in a room of 25 and how to deal with that child and how to be a support system for that child. But teaching our, working with our caseworkers and really lifting them up in their profession. I think we've been able to reduce their turnover from 23% to 13% just in 2 years, so that's pretty big.
To all of you, that's a stunning statistic in our field. Thank you, Mrs. Edwards. Thank you for being willing to stand behind the workforce, because a strong workforce is the only way that we keep and support those kids and those foster parents. Governor Bevin, you say a lot of interesting things, but there are some things that you say that resonate with me. You have questioned government's ability to get this job done. In fact, I heard you say that, why would we demand and insist that government be the solution in this child welfare situation when it never has been? And I was reminded of my first experience when I was appointed at Children's Village. I was so excited to bring my mom, who has been my inspiration, to see my new position. And she walked around. It's a massive campus, 180, 200 acres, right outside New York City, beautiful. And we walked around, and as we went home, she said, "Son, that's terrible. Do those kids actually grow up there? Are you in charge of this? Are you?" And she's the one that reminded me. She said, "Look, government and charity can never be a solution to this. You have private partners in Kentucky that you are working with. What are your expectations of them?"
The reality is government does have a role. Everything I've said, I do agree. I mean, children should be raised by families, not by the government. But government has a role to facilitate an environment in which that is possible, to incentivize this, to reward this. And something you touched on that you all have done in Louisiana that's outstanding, that we've tried to do as well. In my very first budget address, we gave publicly in my State of the Commonwealth address raises to all the social workers and acknowledged them, singled some of them out, invited them to be there, talked about their stories. Why? Because they are struggling. This is a thankless, underpaid, emotionally demanding job, and they feel sometimes frustrated by the inaction of people in positions like ours. In acknowledging this and rewarding them and encouraging them, you asked about what kind of partnerships we look for. I'm going to brag on one that's not in our state because I've always been amazed by it. If you go into any Jordan's Furniture in New England and in Massachusetts, you walk into this is a place that's well known up there. They have these amazing, used to be books, and now video displays of kids. And you see kids that are just looking for a family to love them. And you see their stories and you get a backdrop. These are people, I don't know that government ever asked them to do it. I bet it didn't. But this is a private company who took it upon themselves to say, what is our role to be a good corporate citizen, to stand in the gap? And so we do have others as well in Kentucky. One thing that I did as well, you made a great point about marketing and PR. We just elevate this, then the solution exists. It exists in this room and with everybody we know. It does. The reality is, how is it that we make people aware of this situation? One thing I did when every one of us as governors once a year gets up and tells the people in our state how things are going. It's usually us standing there and everyone trying to stay awake and clap at the right times and wait till we're done. And we tell about good things, and I'm knocking us a little bit. Truth be told, these things tend to be fairly static. I actually showed a big picture on a screen while I was doing this, and it showed a picture of a family, a mother and a father and 3 kids, and every one of them had a number on their T-shirt. And their numbers range from 900 and something to some 4-digit number. And then I explained to people that these were the number of days that these individuals had each waited to get to resolution as it related to either their desire to adopt or their desire to be adopted. It was ridiculous. It was 3 to 4 years each. And yet there was a 100% desire on both ends to make it happen. And this was kind of shocking and sobering to people, but then I literally had that family come in wearing those T-shirts and walk right up onto the dais and take over my State of the Commonwealth address and speak to the entire elected assembly in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. Do you think that had a pretty powerful impact on making this, elevating it in the awareness of the 138 men and women who will pass laws to make change? You bet. Far more than anything I could have ever done. In the next couple weeks after that, we passed one of the most comprehensive child care bills in the history of America. It's House Bill 1 from 2018 in Kentucky. Look at it. It's not perfect, like you have mentioned. There is no perfect anything, but there are things in it that if you're not doing it, I would encourage you to copy it. And if you have ideas we can steal from you, please tell us. But HB 1 2018 is how you put this out and get things done. And it breaks down the barriers of time so that we can get these kids, to your point and the impetus of this question, to the homes and not the institutions that are going to turn them into productive citizens.
Agreed. So all my prepared questions are gone because the governor and the first lady keep driving this conversation the way it should be. Let's talk about storytelling and changing the narrative. Governor Bevin, you took a chance. You got those T-shirts printed. You elevated the discussion. Sean, you're the storyteller. You bring this to life. You bring humor and reality together. What can we do more of? What are we missing here in telling this story? Because the media stories don't tell the story, right? They talk about things that do go wrong, often human tragedy that's scary. Sometimes we are wrong. Sometimes it's just something that we could not have controlled no matter how hard we work together. Things do go wrong. You know the system. What can we learn from you? You're the expert in storytelling. Well, what do we need to hear from you?
Well, the stories around foster care tend to fall into 2 baskets. Either the grim, you should do something because this is so terrible, or they fall into the a basket of sort of that has this sort of rosy sheen of charity on it. And things like seeing a real family in front of people, hearing their stories, and more than anything, what I can't stress enough is involve former foster youth, foster alumni in whatever programs you have, because when these kids go on to, you know, whether they do great things like play for the Patriots or, or you know, someone like Tiffany Haddish who can get up in front of the world and speak candidly, anytime that these kids can own their story, and there's so much shame wrapped around these kids, and anytime they can own their story and just come out and say, you know what, I was in this situation to no fault of my own. I got passed around from family to family. I have issues to work out because of it, but it made me stronger. Here's what I'm doing with my life now. When people can see that, it does two things. It makes the kids believe, hey, I don't have to fall into this stereotype of this kid who's just gonna get lost in the gears of society. And it makes, equally as important, it just makes the general population see them differently and not be quite so afraid of them. So if somebody, you know, so if you tell somebody, you know what, I saw this movie called Instant Family, and it inspired me to to get involved in the foster care system, that instead of your friends and family saying, ooh, I don't know if that's a good idea, that they might be more supportive. In fact, we were just talking earlier that one thing I've been saying all over the country is that if you get pregnant and you go to a dinner party and tell people that you're expecting, nobody goes, ooh, you think that's a good idea? That kid could grow up to steal your car someday or be a drug dealer. I don't know if you should do that. But they just expect that the sky's the limit. It's just going to be nothing but ponies and rainbows. And yet, if you get involved in the system, the first place that people go to in their minds is like, ooh, trouble, trouble, trouble. So anything we can do to change that through story. Oh, and one other thing I wanted to say, the Ad Council, they've been working on new ads around foster care, and they're doing great work. They're very compelling. Like I saw one of them. It was 30 seconds long. I was in tears by the time it was over. So,
thank you, First Lady Edwards. You've done a lot of this work.
Well, I wanted to add to that about the children and the young people presenting. So we started in 2017, Louisiana Institute of Children and Families. A great group of people in Louisiana started that off of the national group CCAI. But to have these young people come during session and walk around and talk to our legislature and get in front of them and be in committees and talk about the aging out and the, you know, raising it to 21. And it's powerful. It's, you know, for them to speak of their own experiences, that is the seller. I mean, you know, for them to say, I've been in, you know, 20 different homes, and now, you know, I was handed a blue folder and said, you know, here you are, it's been, you know, nice knowing you, and you're out on the streets and after that time. And so for them to come and present that and talk to the you know, the people that make the decision is extremely powerful.
Well, speaking of which, we have a gentleman here, Adrian McLemore. Where are you at, Adrian?
Right there.
He's right over there. We met him through the course of making the movie. Adrian works for the Annie Casey Foundation. Adrian grew up in the foster care system, and he also, in his home state of Ohio, he's part of a youth advisory board that is amazing, that I think everybody could learn something from, where they get foster alumni together to advise on all kinds of topics.
Yep.
So feel free to chat him up.
Yeah. Governor Bevin, let me, did you
I was going to make one little point on that,
point.
too. And again, it sounds like these are repetitions on a theme, but to the extent you're not singing off this page in your states, please do, because my wife, the First Lady, started something called the Fly LC, which actually sounds kind of cool, too, and it would work in every state because it's the First Lady's Youth Leadership Council. But it's comprised of exactly folks like this. And one of the first things that was done is we said to them, what are we not doing? From your perspective, how are your needs not being met? And the first two things they brought forward are now the law in Kentucky, which is, and I'll bet it's the case in many of your states, that kids in foster system without the approval of their birth parent, who may or may not either choose to or be in a position to give permission for them to get a driver's license at 16, could not even be considered until they were an adult, and these kids couldn't even get a driver's license. That's insane, and I guarantee it's in a number of your states already. And for good intention, but really no good reason. And so that was one of the first things they said is, why can't we drive? We can't get jobs, we can't have a life. And so They brought that forward. That was taken care of. Fictive kin, if that term doesn't mean anything to you, it's F-I-C-T-I-V-E. Google it up. We don't need to discuss it now other than to say fictive kin is not available in every state. It should be. In short measure, it allows someone who's not family but might be a trusted coach or a teacher or a neighbor or a pastor or a whoever to, for a temporary period of time with no financial or legal specifically mandated responsibility, be able to provide for that child on an interim basis while the parent might be on parole or going through rehab or what have you, the ability to stand in the gap. And that fictive kin and that driver's license bill have changed the lives of so many. It took nothing. You bring these kids in and have them talk to legislators and things get done. The other thing, too, about the voices, there's a guy named Frank Harshaw in Kentucky who owns a large train dealership, HVAC dealership. He was a foster care kid. There's someone like him in every one of your states. Find someone who's been there, who has been blessed like you have, who have risen up and done extraordinary things, and then in turn wanted to give back. Give them the opportunity to do it. They will be great advocates, and they will also find other folks, back to your earlier question, who can be partners in this, because the solutions are out there. We just need to empower people with the ability to get plugged in, because this is 1% and some change of our entire population. We can do this.
Oh, good. We've got about 10 minutes left. I want to jump off something that you said, Sean. And I'm going to ask you the question first, Governor Bevin, and then First Lady Edwards. You reminded us that these kids don't come into care due to no fault of their own, right? But very quickly they get labeled as bad, as broken, as troublemakers. And we need to own some of that because we are the ones that take them away from their family. Governor Bevin, you have a large, inclusive family. You adopted, is it 4?
4. 4 of our 9 children.
4 of your 9 children. I know you make it easy. I watched you on some videos. But hey, look, I'm a parent of 3. I know there's nothing easy with kids. Was there anything instructive in your and the First Lady's experience as adoptive parents that would remind us that these kids are just normal kids that want to be loved unconditionally by at least one person, right? Somebody to love them. Yeah. Talk to us about it. And First Lady Edwards, I want you to think about your own children and talk to us about what you do and what the governor does.
I'll keep this tight because it's true. And it made me laugh at the very beginning when you said people's response was to be afraid of teenagers. Well, heck, if you've ever had a teenager, it doesn't matter whether they were born to you or not, you were probably afraid of them at some point, or at least they wanted you to be. The bottom line is this: it doesn't come with a manual, whether they're born to you or adopted. The reality is, in some measure, ironically, through adoption, you have more ability to have an awareness of what's coming than when they're born to you, to your point. And so to that end, what kids need is someone to love them. In short measure, years ago, more than 10 years ago, my wife and I tried to adopt a child out of the foster care system. And to make a very long story short, at the end of well over a year and multiple fingerprints and multiple checks and multiple home studies and multiple inspections and thousands of dollars being sent all over the place, sometimes duplicative and sometimes because something expired and you had to go back and do it again because by the time the next stage got done, it was insane. And at the end of all of that, we were told that, you know what, you already have 5 children, that's enough, because this child would be the 6th child and she wouldn't get enough attention. It's better for her to stay in the system. She was 11 years old. Wow. She'd been in 14 homes. She is an adult somewhere. It probably has not turned out well. There was no logic. This is the first political job I've ever had. I was nowhere near the political world. But I remember at the time thinking, how outrageous that a family that could take care of 5 would be deemed as unable to take care of 6, and that it's better for that child to end up with nothing as a result. And I thought something should be done about it. Well, this is it. We're it. You're it. I mean, we can do something about this at the end of the day. And the final thing I'll say on this is that, yes, 9 is a lot. Governor DeWine is here. You have 8 children, I think. He knows a little bit about a lot, too, as do some others in this room. The bottom line is this: of course it's a lot. But having more children than hands, which is 3 or more, is the equivalent of, it's the parenting equivalent of terminal velocity. It just is. It doesn't matter if you fall from 100,000 or 10,000 or 1,000, you hit a certain speed, that's it. Once you have more children than hands, which is 3, you are there. The only thing that will really change in your life with absolute certainty is what you drive, and the cool factor of what you drive will go down rapidly. That said, nothing else really changes, so it's 100% doable. And I would say this in closing. If you are not in a position to adopt, or you are not in a position to foster, you know somebody that you could come alongside and help with an encouraging word, with a meal prepared, with an offer to be their backup so they can have a date night, with the ability to say, listen, I notice you got 3 kids that are the ages of mine were 3 years ago. I got a closet full of stuff. Why don't you come over if you want any little simple stuff. This is so easily fixed if we all actually get engaged. So my point is it a lot? Sure. And let me just finally say, the true secret to me making it look easy is because of my wife. So let's be completely honest about it. I get to make it look easy. She's the mother of 9 children, God bless her. So, but be a part of the solution.
How many points does he get for that? I mean, that's a lot of points.
And at one point, speaking of teenagers, until our oldest turned 20 a couple months ago, I had 7 teenagers in our house at one time. Some born to us, some not. 6 of them were girls. So I'm just saying, it can be done. Can be done.
We all aspire to be like Governor Babin, but First Lady Edwards, every time I hear you speak, you describe children in foster care as our children.
They are.
I mean, you never forget to do that. Talk to us about that.
Well,
why is it so important to you to capture that image?
Because they are our children, and you were talking about the people that can wrap themselves around it. You know, at any given time, we have over 4,000 children in foster care in our state, and I always say we have over 4,000 churches, and at every church would recruit one family within that church, and then that one family wrap themselves around that child. We could do amazing things. We have a group in New Orleans called Crossroads NOLA, and their church is using the faith-based community, and they're starting to duplicate this all across our state, but where they're recruiting families within the church. And then the church wraps themselves around, that family who's the adoptive family. But some other programs, Open Table is doing some remarkable things in our state within the church. And so getting people to wrap themselves around those foster parents and giving them the help and support they need, that's a big plus. That's especially when you have as many as you do. But I'm just to encourage, one of the things that came out of our summit and our website, LouisianaFosters.org, was to have a networking place where we have, wonderful nonprofit groups we have Go Bags. Of course, we spell it different than everybody else, GEAUX. Go Bags, and we have other Braveheart that they're doing amazing things by collecting things in a bag where that child is taken in the middle of the night. They have a bag of goods and things they can take with them. They're just networking and letting everybody know that these things are available. So that's what we wanted to do with the Louisiana Fosters, is have a place where everybody could go and say, oh, how can I help? I can't foster a child, but I can help with resources, or I can help with tutoring, or I can help help with some lessons of Little League or dance. But everybody can be a part of this equation. They just have to find out where they fit.
Thank you. We've got 3 minutes left. Let's take a minute each. Sean, what's the takeaway? What's the takeaway? How do we change this?
Well, there's one other thing that I wanted to mention that we're working on right now with with a group of foster alumni. We're creating, for lack of a better word, a logo that is like a pride logo that we are going to roll out in the next couple of months. We're going to try to really bring this thing nationwide and hopefully worldwide. Right now, kids in care, they carry a lot of shame, a lot of needless shame. And they are so strong, they're so tenacious, they are so resilient, and they never get credit for these things that unfortunately come from a difficult place, that when you are battling against great odds, you also cultivate great qualities that you should be able to be proud of. So we're, thank you. I'm going to talk to you about this for sure. and by the way, thank you, all of you who are here to talk about this. But we want to bring this out so that kids can have something on a hat, on a T-shirt, on wherever, and a conversation piece. So instead of being ashamed of who they are, that they can say, no, this represents where I come from, and I'm not ashamed of it. And I'm happy to tell you my story.
Thank you. Governor Bevan, 30 seconds, and then we'll give Mrs. Edwards a minute.
No. I mean, I would simply say this again. Thank you for being here. You are the solution. If you think nothing can be done about this, you're right. I beg to differ, and I think we can do something about it, and I think we will. I would simply say this. We're pouring all in Kentucky. We're happy to share anything that we are doing with any of you, and we're happy to learn anything that you would like to share with us. This year, in 2019 in Kentucky, every one of you, governors and every first spouse, is going to be invited to come to summits that are going to involve a whole lot of people that you know from the world that you come from who care about this and are pouring in. That will be an attraction in some measure, but they're people who want to see solutions to trafficking and adoption and foster care needs. We're going to be having a number of summits and meetings in Kentucky. We want every governor to come, please. You will find it time well spent. We will be concentrated in this effort, and the bottom line is, let's just get out there and fix it. And thank you so much for having this panel.
One of the things I failed to mention was Marquita Walters started QPI, which is a Quality Parent Initiative, and it is, instead of piloting the program, she's done it statewide, which has been a game changer. And so that's been so helpful. One of the things I said, our children, the foster children, are our children, and they are our future. And if we don't invest in these children, our children, then we're not investing in our future. And so it's just a no-brainer. So I'm excited to be a part of this movement and elevating the conversation and bringing awareness and everybody talking about it and figuring out and making it less intimidating, like you said, especially when it comes to teenagers, and really just bringing the awareness and educating people on the whole.
I think you just did.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Good job. Awesome. Well done.
I'll text you.